The world did not wake up one morning and decide to murder millions of its own. It drifted there quietly, almost tenderly, step by step, word by word, order by order. The path to the Einsatzgruppen did not begin with gunfire or flame. It began with whispers, with paperwork, with the steady rhythm of pens scratching across paper in dimly lit offices, while the hum of a tired nation convinced itself that cruelty was reason and obedience was peace. Germany after the Great War was not a country. It was a wound that refused to heal. The streets of Berlin echoed with hunger. Children scavenged through ash heaps for food, while old men clung to uniforms that no longer meant anything. In the smoky beer halls, veterans talked about betrayal, about how victory had been stolen, not lost, stolen. The Treaty of Versailles, they said, had broken them. But the truth was more insidious. It wasn't the treaty that hollowed Germany out. It was the humiliation of believing that someone, somewhere, had driven the knife into their back. The legend of the Dolchstoß, the stab in the back, began as an excuse whispered by defeated generals who could not bear their own failure. But a lie repeated often enough becomes memory, and memory hardens into faith. Soon it wasn't just an excuse, it was a national gospel. The Jews, the communists, the intellectuals, the traitors within. These were the villains of the story Germany told itself to survive. When the monarchy collapsed and the republic rose from its ashes, democracy carried within it an infection, resentment dressed as patriotism. The flags changed, the uniforms changed, but the longing stayed the same. The yearning for greatness, for unity, for something to believe in after years of chaos. Men who once marched under the Kaiser's banner now followed new symbols, the black, the red, the white, not because they understood them, but because they were tired of not belonging. The streets of Weimar, Germany, were battlegrounds of ideology. Hunger bred anger. Anger bred simplicity. Purity. Restoration. Renewal. Words that sounded like medicine but were mixed with poison. And in that soil, dark, wet with despair, obedience began to grow. It didn't come through fear alone, but through exhaustion. Democracy, with its endless debates and fragile compromises, had felt confusing, weak. But dictatorship? That sounded like clarity. One leader, one truth, one destiny. So when Adolf Hitler's voice rose through the radios in beer halls, loud, rhythmic, hypnotic, promising deliverance from shame, they listened. They listened not because they were cruel, but because they were weary. Weary of losing, of uncertainty, of feeling small in a world that had forgotten them. His words were the balm and the chain in one breath. He gave them a new story to believe in, the German reborn, the German as victim, the German as savior. And buried deep within that myth was a promise whispered like a prayer. We will cleanse the world of everything that made us weak. It didn't begin with armies. It began with offices, committees, regulations, forms stamped and filed. The machinery of obedience assembled itself in silence. Police, teachers, lawyers, clerks, each believing they were building a stronger Germany. The police that once served the law now served ideology. The courts that once upheld justice now codified persecution. Schools began to teach children that empathy was a flaw, that suspicion was safety, that hatred was duty. The poison spread politely through classrooms, through newspapers, through sermons that traded compassion for certainty. The new Reich was not powered by monsters. It was powered by neighbors, by teachers grading assignments, by secretaries typing orders, by railway conductors who clipped tickets for trains that would never return. Each played their role. Each told themselves they were only doing their part. Evil had found its rhythm, a lullaby of bureaucracy. And standing at the heart of that lullaby was a man carved from ice, Reinhard Heydrich. Tall, immaculate, precise, the golden image of the Aryan myth. To his superiors, he was perfection incarnate, efficient, ambitious, and utterly without hesitation. To those beneath him, he was something worse, a man who could drain warmth from a room with a single glance. Where others saw faces, he saw data. Where others hesitated, he calculated. Heydrich didn't shout. He didn't rage. He organized. His genius was the machinery of death, not its spectacle. He envisioned a world where people could be managed, like numbers, where the unwanted could be categorized, relocated, erased. His creation, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Main Security Office, was not just an institution. It was the architecture of total control. Inside its corridors, the walls were lined not with flags or trophies, but with maps of Europe marked by race, religion, and ideology. The continent was no longer geography. It was a spreadsheet of lives to be rearranged. And it was there, in the hum of that bureaucracy, that the idea of the Einsatzgruppen was born, not yet in blood, but in ink. Before the first shot echoed across Poland, there were meetings, polite, efficient meetings in rooms that smelled of tobacco and fear. Men with titles debated logistics, not morality. How to make deportations more orderly. How to ensure executions didn't disrupt military operations. How to manage population transfers without unnecessary attention. Death became an administrative problem, solved by signatures and stamps. No one shouted, no one screamed, no one had to. The killings began before the victims even knew they were condemned, decided in sentences, scribbled in margins, approved with quiet nods behind closed doors. By the late 1932, Germany breathed propaganda like air. Posters lined the streets, radio speeches pulsed through every home. The Jew was no longer a neighbor but a contagion. The communist was no longer an idea but a threat. The Roma, the disabled, the Slavic peoples, all dissolved into categories of contamination. And the German, he was the cure, the righteous man standing against decay. Righteousness became a narcotic. Obedience, its altar. The language of morality was inverted. To hate became holy, to kill became patriotic, and those who hesitated were not brave, they were weak. Every trench that would later swallow its victims, every bullet that would tear through flesh, every scream that would vanish into forest or field, all of it was born here, in the quiet prelude of ideas. Genocide never begins with the sound of gunfire. It begins with the decision to stop seeing. It begins when silence becomes easier than speaking, when decency becomes inconvenient. The men who would later drive the death trucks were once civil servants and students. They attended lectures on ethics, kissed their wives goodnight, wrote letters that began with "My dearest" and ended with "Heil Hitler." They didn't see themselves as killers. They saw themselves as guardians defending civilization from imagined corruption. When the time came to pull the trigger, they did not think. They obeyed. That is the secret horror of the Reich. Not that it was monstrous, but that it was ordinary. The trains ran on time. The files were organized. The uniforms fit perfectly. The words duty and discipline disguised the abyss beneath them. Civilization hadn't collapsed. It had been weaponized. The machine worked exactly as designed. And when German forces crossed into Poland in 1939, that machine moved with them. The Einsatzgruppen followed close behind, not soldiers, but functionaries of extermination. Their mission was not conquest, but correction. To cleanse what was unclean, to purify what was tainted. Villages, towns, entire communities were marked for erasure long before the first boots stepped across the border. The orders were written in calm, bureaucratic prose. Secure the area, neutralize hostile elements, ensure political and racial purification. Each phrase was a mask for murder. But the real decision, the true beginning, had been made long before that first village burned. It had been made in the hearts of millions who believed that obedience was virtue, that silence was safety, that following orders absolved them of choice. This is where our story begins. Not with the echo of rifles or the roar of tanks, but with the soft turning of a page, the click of a typewriter key, the hush of compliance. It begins with an idea, one so simple it could fit in a whisper. Some lives are worth less than others. Once that idea is planted, it grows like ivy through every wall, every school, every conscience, until the world itself forgets what mercy sounded like. The Einsatzgruppen were not born overnight. They were grown, cultivated in the soil of fear, watered by myth, fed by a people desperate to belong. They were the harvest of obedience, a crop nurtured by those who mistook silence for virtue. And as the lights dimmed across Europe, as trains began their journeys eastward under the cover of night, the world began to sing to itself a lullaby made of orders and excuses. A song so soft, so reasonable, that no one noticed it had become a dirge. The lullaby of obedience had begun, and its verses would echo through the forests, the fields, and the graves of millions, until the world finally woke up too late to the silence it had sung into being. The rise of the SS state. The night after Hitler seized power was not one of wild celebration. It was one of quiet, organized work. Inside the ministries of Berlin, the lights burned late. Typewriters clattered, files were opened, and the dull rhythm of paperwork began its slow conversion of ideology into procedure. Every revolution needs its administrators, and in the new Reich, they wore black. The Schutzstaffel, once a small bodyguard for the Führer, was becoming something else entirely. Under Heinrich Himmler's careful hand, it ceased to be a mere paramilitary force and grew into a new aristocracy, one bound not by bloodlines, but by belief. The SS man was to be a priest of ideology, the guardian of racial purity, the keeper of secrets. Himmler spoke of it as a state within a state, a living organism that would one day replace all others. Behind his pale eyes was a vision of Germany, reborn through discipline, through faith, through selective cruelty. Reinhard Heydrich stood at his side, a contrast of elegance and precision, the mind to Himmler's obsession. Together they built an empire of order, a structure that fused intelligence, police power, and ideology into a single mechanism. In early 1939, the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, emerged as its beating heart. 7 departments, each devoted to a different facet of control: espionage, counterintelligence, criminal policing, ideological research, and the grim logistics of population management. Beneath them, hundreds of smaller offices spread like roots through every province of the Reich. Wherever there was a typewriter, a file, or a telephone, there was an artery of the SS state. The transformation of Germany was astonishing in its speed. A decade earlier, the nation had been a democracy of quarrelsome parties and raucous newspapers. Now, dissent existed only in whispers. The Gestapo needed few informants. Neighbors and colleagues volunteered the work. Fear and loyalty became indistinguishable. Each denunciation, each anonymous letter, was another brick in the wall that sealed the people inside their own silence. The SS had discovered the most efficient tool of control: the ordinary citizen convinced he was serving the greater good. Heydrich understood the psychology of obedience better than anyone. He rarely shouted, rarely threatened. He simply created systems, forms, procedures, regulations through which brutality could appear respectable. A beating, a deportation, a disappearance could all be justified if the paperwork was in order. Murder became a clerical act. Conscience was filed away under "not applicable." The men who filled these offices did not imagine themselves executioners. They were administrators, following the chain of command, protected by the illusion that responsibility always belonged to someone higher up. While the ministries worked by lamplight, Germany itself began to gleam. The rallies at Nuremberg, the uniforms cut to mathematical symmetry, the torches reflected in the polished helmets, all of it projected strength and unity. Beneath the spectacle, the machinery of exclusion tightened. The Nuremberg laws stripped citizenship from the Jews and outlawed love between them and Aryans. The law books that once defended the weak now recorded the logic of segregation. Each decree was greeted not with outrage but with applause. After years of uncertainty, the people felt that the nation was finally sure of itself again. In the corridors of the SS headquarters on Prinz Albrecht Strasse, Heydrich's staff mapped out the next stage. Control of information. The Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, collected rumors, analyzed moods, and reported directly to the Reich leadership. Every whisper in a bar, every sermon in a church, every letter intercepted by postal sensors fed into the vast intelligence machine. A country that once prided itself on culture now measured loyalty through silence. Books were burned, professors dismissed, and artists vanished into the gray bureaucracy of camps whose names were still unknown to most Germans. Dachau was the prototype, a training ground not only for guards, but for the very concept of organized cruelty. The SS state learned quickly that terror need not always be visible. It could be subtle, administrative, almost invisible. A knock at midnight, a missing co-worker, an empty desk at the office. The message spread without words. The Gestapo had only 7,000 officers in a nation of 70 million, but it did not need more. Each German carried the Gestapo in his head. As the late 1930 seconds unfolded, the regime's ambitions turned outward. Austria was swallowed in a single night, its citizens cheering as the swastikas unfurled over Vienna. In the Sudetenland, German troops were greeted with flowers. To the world it seemed like national pride restored, but within the SS, the conquests were seen as experiments, laboratories for domination. In these annexed territories, new forms of control were tested: population registries, ethnic classifications, deportation procedures. Each successful trial brought the machine closer to perfection. Heydrich oversaw it all with icy detachment. To him, administration was art. Each file completed, each train scheduled, each camp expanded, was a note in the symphony of order he was composing. Himmler, meanwhile, filled the ranks of the SS with men who believed themselves chosen. Their bloodlines were traced, their marriages approved, their loyalties measured. They were to be the seed of a new race, obedient, merciless, pure. The oath they swore was not to Germany, but to Hitler personally, an oath that fused politics with religion and replaced morality with devotion. The apparatus of annihilation now existed in blueprint. It awaited only its opportunity. That opportunity would come in September 1939, when the Wehrmacht crossed the Polish frontier and the SS state followed behind it like a shadow. But before the guns thundered, the groundwork had been laid. The elimination of empathy, the elevation of duty, the conviction that history itself demanded cruelty. To live in Germany in those years was to feel the walls closing softly. Most people adjusted, as people always do. They kept their heads down, repeated the slogans, avoided the questions that had no safe answers. Some believed sincerely, others simply learned not to care. A few saw the abyss opening and tried to resist, but resistance required speech, and speech had become dangerous. In this atmosphere of orchestrated silence, the SS state thrived. It needed no applause, only submission. When Hitler spoke of destiny, he meant expansion, but the SS translated it into purification. They were not merely defending Germany, they were reshaping humanity. The laboratories at Dachau experimented with poison gases and vaccines. The race offices measured skulls and catalogued ancestry. Science, faith, and bureaucracy fused into a single creed, that the world could be engineered into harmony if the impure were removed. It was an idea as intoxicating as it was lethal. By the eve of the invasion of Poland, the transformation was complete. The police had become soldiers, the soldiers had become ideologues, and the ideologues had become administrators of death. The line between law and murder had dissolved. Orders from above could now authorize anything, and the men who carried them out needed only to obey. The SS state was no longer an institution, it was a state of mind. Its citizens marched in step, believing that they were building a future free of weakness and doubt. And in that belief lay the quiet terror of what was to come. For when obedience becomes a virtue, every atrocity can be justified as duty fulfilled. In the final summer before the war, Berlin glittered with parades and speeches celebrating unity and destiny. Beneath the banners, trains waited in the yards, ready to carry troops eastward. In the offices of the RSHA, Fresh maps were pinned to walls, new categories added to forms, new lists prepared. The men in black uniforms moved efficiently through their routines, unaware or unwilling to see that the order they served was already devouring its own soul. They were ready. The machine was ready. And somewhere in the dark, the future victims slept, unaware that the machinery of their destruction was already humming quietly beyond the horizon. The lullaby continues slow, rhythmic, inevitable. The world breathes in before the storm, and the architects of obedience wait for the signal that will turn their silence into fire. From police to executioners, the morning air in Poland smelled of wet soil and diesel. The sound of boots crunching over gravel had become as common as birdsong. Villages awoke not to the rhythm of daily life, but to the low growl of engines and the echo of orders shouted in German. For the men of the new mobile task forces, the Einsatzgruppen, this was the beginning of routine. The war had only just begun, but their instructions were already clear. Eliminate enemies of the Reich. What that meant would expand, day by day, until it consumed everything. These men had not arrived as conquerors in the traditional sense. They were not frontline troops or decorated soldiers. Most had come from police units, administrative offices, and provincial security detachments. They wore the same uniforms as warriors, but carried something far deadlier than rifles: the authority to decide who lived and who did not. For the first time in modern history, mass murder was not an act of frenzy or battlefield chaos. It was policy. It came with paperwork, signatures, and the assurance that it was both necessary and good. They began as policemen trained to maintain order. Many had once directed traffic or investigated thefts. They had served warrants, written reports, and shaken hands with townspeople. Now they were told that their service to the fatherland required them to cleanse the occupied territories of all elements that might threaten the purity of the new Europe. Their task was not just to enforce laws, it was to erase lives that the law no longer protected. In the first days of occupation, they worked methodically. Local officials were rounded up. Teachers, priests, and mayors disappeared into trucks. The orders spoke of decapitation of leadership, a phrase that cloaked executions beneath the language of efficiency. The fields behind villages became graveyards before anyone knew what was happening. When the gunfire stopped, the men returned to camp, cleaned their weapons, and filled out forms confirming that the operation had been successfully completed. The paperwork always used the same words: action against enemies, security measure, special treatment. No one wrote murder. In the SS lexicon, language had become anesthesia. Each euphemism dulled the conscience just enough for the next act to seem tolerable. The Einsatzgruppen expanded quickly, small units of men following the army's advance, moving like shadows behind the front lines. They were not large, only a few thousand in total, but their reach would extend across millions of square kilometers. They were the cleanup crews of conquest. Where the army conquered, the Einsatzgruppen purified. The men quickly learned to adapt their methods. In the beginning, they executed political prisoners, communists, intellectuals, anyone connected to the Polish state. But the line blurred almost immediately. Jews were labeled potential partisans, potential spies, potential threats. That was all the justification needed. In practice, the word potential meant inevitable. Many of the killers were not fanatics. They were bureaucrats in uniform, ordinary functionaries who wanted to do their jobs well. In the evenings, they wrote letters home about the countryside, about the weather, about the comradeship of their unit. Some sent photographs, smiling faces beside trucks, laughter at field kitchens. Rarely did they mention the bodies. When they did, it was in the language of fatigue. The work was hard today. We were efficient. As weeks passed, the killing became routine. Villages were surrounded at dawn. The residents were gathered, first the men, then the women and children. A translator read out an order accusing them of sabotage or collaboration. The condemned were led to a field, instructed to dig, told it was for defense works or trenches. Then came the shots. At first, the executions were chaotic. The men were nervous. Some aimed poorly, others hesitated. The officers noticed. The next day they reorganized the procedure. Firing squads were positioned in lines. Victims were instructed to stand or kneel in specific places. Efficiency improved. Eyewitnesses recall how the men grew quieter over time. Jokes faded. The gunfire became rhythmic. Killing was no longer an act of passion, it was a process. By the end of 1939, the pattern was set. Every occupied territory would experience the same sequence: registration, segregation, deportation, elimination. Each step required coordination between military, police, and civil administration. Each act had a corresponding form to be filed. The genocide of the future was being rehearsed in miniature. The officers in charge, men like Ohlendorf, Nebe, and Rasch, sent regular reports to Berlin. They wrote with the precision of accountants. 1,500 executed. Operation completed without incident. Local population cooperative. To read these documents is to enter a world where numbers replaced lives. The value of a man or woman was measured only by their classification on a list. For the soldiers who witnessed these events, something began to shift. The boundaries of right and wrong dissolved. When all around you, the law itself, commits the crime, morality becomes a foreign tongue. Many drank heavily, some vomited after shootings. A few refused orders and were quietly reassigned, not executed, despite the myth that refusal meant death. But most stayed. They adjusted. Human beings are capable of adapting to almost anything, even atrocity. There were exceptions. A handful of officers wrote letters expressing unease. A chaplain tried to intervene on moral grounds. A policeman fainted during an execution and was sent home for nervous exhaustion. Yet for each man who faltered, another stepped forward, determined to prove his reliability. The Einsatzgruppen did not require zeal, only compliance. The speed of their operations astonished even their commanders. Town after town, the pattern repeated. Jews were forced into ghettos, stripped of property, confined, and then eliminated. By the spring of 1940, hundreds of thousands were dead. The killings were not hidden. Locals often watched from windows or fields. Some turned away, others cheered. Collaboration became as common as silence. In villages across Poland and later the Soviet territories, the ground itself became a map of graves, forest clearings, sand pits, riverbanks, each location known to locals, yet seldom spoken of. The soil covered the evidence, but the memory lingered like smoke. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Heydrich reviewed the reports with clinical satisfaction. His experiment was working. The men were efficient, obedient, and silent. The system was scalable. All that remained was to refine the method. Bullets were effective, but slow. Ammunition was costly. More importantly, mass shootings were psychologically taxing. Even hardened men grew restless under the weight of constant slaughter. At Minsk, Himmler himself witnessed a shooting and turned pale. The screams and the blood unsettled him. When it was over, he pulled an officer aside and said quietly, "Such methods are unsustainable." The order went out soon after, "Find a more efficient solution." But that solution, gas chambers, deportation trains, industrial extermination, was still a few months away. For now, the Einsatzgruppen continued their work with rifles and pistols under the open sky. They moved eastward behind the Wehrmacht. Each bullet another entry in a ledger. Each corpse another statistic in the arithmetic of ideology. What began as policing had become execution. The men who once enforced law now enforced annihilation. Their transformation was nearly complete. They were no longer individuals with private doubts or histories. They were components of a system that had found its purpose. At night, in their barracks, some still dreamt of home. The smell of blood lingered on their uniforms. They washed their hands, but the scent remained. In letters to wives they wrote of duty, of patriotism, of the necessity of hard measures in hard times. They convinced themselves they were part of something larger than horror, that history demanded their obedience. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the fog lay thick over the fields, the world seemed suspended. Somewhere, a rooster crowed. A new day began, and with it, the routine resumed. Trucks rolling, orders given, shots fired, silence returned. This was the rhythm of the new order. Not chaos, not madness, but calm precision, the kind of calm that only exists when conscience is gone. The line between man and machine had blurred, and in that blur, the future of the Holocaust was already written. The blueprint for conquest. The snow fell softly over Berlin in the winter of 1939, muffling the hum of the city that never truly slept. Inside the gray offices of the Reich Main Security Office, where cigarette smoke hung in motionless layers and typewriters chattered like insects, men in black uniforms were writing the future. They called it security policy. In truth, it was the architecture of annihilation being drafted line by line, as neatly as any city plan. The reports arriving from occupied Poland were grim but promising. They spoke of villages cleansed, of populations processed, of enemies neutralized. In these euphemisms, the bureaucrats found a language that made the unthinkable manageable. Paperwork replaced empathy. Stamps and signatures carried more weight than screams. Reinhard Heydrich reviewed the figures in silence, the tip of his fountain pen tapping rhythmically against the desk, as if marking time. The experiment was working. The machinery of death could be scaled. Poland had been a laboratory. There, under the pretense of security operations, the Einsatzgruppen had tested their methods: registration, segregation, deportation, liquidation. It had been brutal and chaotic, but effective. The reports made clear one lesson above all: mass murder could be organized. The killing did not need to be spontaneous or driven by rage. It could be planned, scheduled, coordinated across departments like any other government project. As the winter deepened, the boundaries between war and policy dissolved. The invasion of Poland had been justified as a military necessity. What followed became administrative routine. The ghettos that sprang up in Warsaw, Łódź, Kraków, and Lublin were not temporary holding pens, but the foundations of a system, an open-air prelude to extermination. Each ghetto was catalogued, its population counted, its output measured. Jews were reduced to labor quotas and caloric needs, their lives calculated against the demands of German industry. In Warsaw, over 400,000 people were crammed into an area barely 3 square miles in size. Starvation became policy, disease an ally. The ghettos were meant to weaken, to prepare their inhabitants for removal under the guise of resettlement. In Berlin, Heydrich wrote of these conditions as necessary measures. He understood that suffering itself was a form of control. Within the army command, some officers protested. They claimed the executions and deportations were undermining order, fueling resistance. But their objections carried no weight against the iron logic of ideology. The Reich had decided that certain people were not merely enemies, but contagions. In the new Europe being built, cleansing was destiny. The Einsatzgruppen were not the only instruments of this vision. Civil administrators, railway planners, accountants all played their part. The Ministry of Transport coordinated deportation trains with the same precision used to ship coal and steel. The Finance Ministry seized Jewish property and billed families for the cost of their own deportation. Each office contributed to the efficiency of killing, each clerk a cog turning silently in the vast machine. The soldiers in the field, meanwhile, learned to see themselves as pioneers. In speeches to his men, Heinrich Himmler described them as engineers of the future, clearing the soil for the new German Empire. He spoke of biological struggle, of racial hygiene, of necessary hardness. It was not murder, he insisted it was surgery. Germany was cutting away the diseased parts of Europe so that civilization might live. His words were cold medicine for the conscience. In the small towns of occupied Poland, the blueprint took visible shape. Jewish councils were forced to implement German orders, to compile lists of their own people, to allocate rations and labor. Collaboration was not a choice but a trap. Those who resisted were executed. Those who obeyed prolonged the agony of their communities. The Einsatzgruppen needed little manpower because terror itself was self-replicating. Once the pattern was established, victims administered their own destruction. The killings themselves evolved. At first, mass shootings were carried out in open fields, visible to locals. Over time, they became more concealed. Pits were dug in forests, ravines chosen for their seclusion. The squads learned from experience where to position trucks for transport, how to dig trenches for maximum efficiency, how to silence witnesses. A system was emerging, one that fused industrial logic with medieval cruelty. Back in Berlin, Adolf Eichmann observed these developments with bureaucratic fascination. A former salesman with a talent for logistics, he began collecting data on transport capacity, rail schedules, and available labor. To him, genocide was a matter of coordination. The question was not whether people should die, but how to move them efficiently to where death awaited. He took pride in his precision, in the elegance of organization. When asked later how he felt about his work, he said simply, "I was a specialist in transportation." As the blueprint expanded eastward, its ideological foundations hardened. Hitler's speeches framed the coming war against the Soviet Union as a holy crusade, a struggle not just for territory, but for racial survival. The Slavs were to be enslaved or eliminated. The Jews, portrayed as the masterminds of Bolshevism, were to be exterminated. The invasion, planned for 1941, would not merely be a campaign of conquest, it would be a campaign of cleansing. Heydrich and Himmler understood that this required coordination on an unprecedented scale. The lessons of Poland would be applied to an entire continent. The Einsatzgruppen would follow the armies into the Soviet Union, operating as mobile killing units with full authority to execute all elements hostile to the Reich. Their mission would no longer be limited to political enemies. It would encompass whole populations. In preparation, new units were trained, new officers selected. Psychological screening was minimal. Ideological reliability mattered more than moral capacity. Many recruits came from the Ordnungspolizei, the regular German police. Their familiarity with procedures, documentation, and obedience made them ideal candidates. The transformation from protector to executioner was swift. Orders were to be followed, questions discouraged. On the eve of Operation Barbarossa, Heydrich issued his final instructions. The language was cold, technical, and deliberately vague. In the occupied territories, measures are to be taken for the neutralization of potential threats. Particular attention to be paid to Jewish Bolshevik agitators. Everyone knew what it meant. Vagueness was protection. Those who killed could claim they misunderstood. Those who ordered could claim they never specified. It was a perfect circle of guilt without confession. When the invasion began in June 1941, the blueprint became reality. Columns of trucks rolled east behind the front lines, carrying men and supplies. Among them were the Einsatzgruppen, now fully formed, armed and indoctrinated. They moved silently, waiting for the moment when their real work would begin. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. The Wehrmacht advanced thousands of kilometers in weeks. Villages fell before they even realized war had reached them. Behind the armies, the death squads fanned out, following lists already prepared. Local collaborators guided them to Jewish neighborhoods. Rabbis, teachers, community leaders, anyone who might inspire resistance, were the first to die. Each shooting became easier than the last. Efficiency bred numbness. Soon the squads were killing hundreds in a day, then thousands. Reports flooded back to Berlin, describing progress. In a single summer, entire regions were declared Judenfrei, free of Jews. The blueprint had achieved its purpose. Yet even as the killing reached new heights, the system continued to evolve. The mass graves filled too quickly. Ammunition shortages loomed, and the psychological toll on the shooters, however hardened, was beginning to show. Commanders complained of drunkenness, of men breaking down, of nightmares that would not end. The problem, as Himmler saw it, was not moral but logistical. Murder needed to be made easier. From these concerns came the next stage: mechanization. The development of gas vans, of fixed killing centers, of extermination camps that could operate like factories. The lessons of the Einsatzgruppen, their precision, their coordination, their obedience, became the template for genocide on an industrial scale. But in that cold winter of 1939, as the first plans were drawn, no one could yet see how far it would go. The men who signed those papers believed they were shaping history, forging an empire that would last 1,000 years. What they built instead was a machine that devoured its creators, a system that transformed civilization into a weapon against itself. In the quiet corridors of Berlin's ministries, the typewriters continued their steady rhythm. Forms were stamped, orders filed, coffee poured. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the city in a white silence that looked almost peaceful. Beneath it, the machinery of death was already turning, invisible but unstoppable. The blueprint was complete. The conquest of Europe would not just redraw borders, it would redefine what it meant to be human. Ashes beneath the birch trees. The snow had melted early that spring, and with it the ground gave up its secrets. In the small clearing beyond the birch trees, the soil sagged in long, uneven mounds, silent scars left by hands that once trembled with cold and command. The men of the Einsatzgruppen had already moved on, but the earth had not forgotten. It remembered the rhythm of boots, the staccato of gunfire, the dull thuds that followed. For those who came after the farmers, the wandering children, the stray animals, there was no need to ask what had happened here. The silence itself was an answer. In the early days of 1942, the killing had become routine, almost rhythmic. Reports flowed back to Berlin with mechanical precision. Tallies, coordinates, efficiency metrics for death. Each village was a number, each ravine a ledger entry. To the men writing the reports, it was a job done well. To those buried beneath, it was the erasure of generations. Orders arrived with the same casual authority as requests for fuel or ammunition. They came stamped with the insignia of the Reich, written in clean German script, as though murder could be domesticated into administration. The transition from shooting to industrial killing was not a sudden revelation but a gradual surrender to practicality. Himmler had witnessed one of the executions outside Minsk and turned pale at the sight, not from pity, but from inefficiency. The screaming, the blood, the physical exhaustion of the shooters, all of it struck him as wasteful. There had to be a better way, he thought. A cleaner, more efficient method to achieve the same ends without soiling the psyche of those who served. And so began the search for mechanical solutions to moral ruin. At first came the vans. Innocent in design, they bore the markings of standard logistics vehicles, but inside their walls, the air itself became a weapon. The exhaust was rerouted into sealed compartments where victims were told they were being transported. When the doors opened, the only sound was the hiss of escaping fumes. The bodies were limp, the silence complete. For the officers, it was easier this way. No more bullets, no more trembling hands. The driver could smoke a cigarette as he steered death along forest roads. Yet even the vans could not keep pace with the ambition. The East was vast, and the numbers were greater than any engine could consume. Trains began to move in their place, and the destinations were no longer unnamed fields, but purpose-built facilities. Factories where death was the product, and ash the byproduct. The shift from open-air shooting to enclosed gas chambers was not born of mercy, but of management. The killing had matured into industry, but for the men of the Einsatzgruppen, who had lived through the first phase, the memories clung like frost to their uniforms. They carried them to new assignments, new uniforms, new lives, but the echoes followed. Some drank until dawn, Others wrote letters home filled with rehearsed justifications about duty and survival. A few, too few, broke. The SS called it mental fatigue. The rest called it what it was: the creeping rot of the soul. Among them was Karl Reiner, a young officer barely 30, who had joined for the promise of honor and found himself commanding a death squad outside Kharkov. He had memorized the procedures, the phrases that stripped horror into order: security operation, liquidation of undesirables. But every night, when the fires dimmed and the cold crept in, he saw the faces. Not in dreams he had stopped sleeping, but in every shadow, every reflection in the black windows of his truck. Once, after a long night's work, he wrote a single line in his diary: "We are all becoming the thing we claim to destroy." The next morning, he tore the page out and burned it. Words were dangerous in a system built on silence. Back in Berlin, the reports continued. The numbers pleased Himmler. Heydrich's replacement, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, took pride in how efficiently the East was being cleared. The term Jew-free entered the vocabulary of occupation, a phrase spoken with bureaucratic satisfaction, as if describing a well-swept floor. The meetings in air-conditioned offices bore no resemblance to the frozen pits of the front. The men who signed the orders never smelled blood or heard the cries that refused to end even after the shooting stopped. For them, death was a statistic, an achievement graph climbing ever upward. The soldiers at the front learned to look away. When the columns of people passed through their checkpoints, old men, mothers clutching infants, children dragging small bundles, they told themselves it was none of their concern. Their orders were to fight, not to question. And yet, every man who watched those convoys vanish into the trees knew what waited on the other side. Some joked nervously to mask their unease. Others grew silent, their laughter replaced by mechanical obedience. The line between witness and accomplice blurred until it disappeared entirely. By summer, the smell of decay hung heavy in the air. Entire regions had been processed. Villages that once hummed with life now stood hollow, their streets filled with echoes. German officers began to speak of operational zones rather than towns. The human geography of Eastern Europe was being redrawn with gunfire and ash. Rivers ran thick with runoff from the graves. Even nature seemed to recoil. Crows circled fields that no longer yielded crops, feeding on what the earth could no longer hide. Resistance flickered like candlelight against the storm. In the forests of Belarus and Ukraine, partisans formed: Jews, Poles, escaped prisoners, anyone with breath and rage enough to fight back. They struck at rail lines, ambushed convoys, sent messages west. Their weapons were few, their chances slimmer still, but their defiance mattered. Each act of resistance was a whisper that the machinery was not absolute, that somewhere within the smoke and slaughter, humanity had not been extinguished. In one burned-out village, a single survivor remained a child, no older than 10. A reconnaissance patrol found him days later, wandering near the graves. When asked what had happened, he said only, "They took the noise away." The soldiers didn't understand, but they led him back to their camp, fed him, cleaned him, then sent him to a refugee column. His name was never recorded. He disappeared into the tide of history, one of countless ghosts carried forward on the wind. The Einsatzgruppen were dissolving, even as their work continued. The fronts were collapsing, the war turning against the Reich. Orders shifted from extermination to concealment. Pits were reopened, bodies exhumed and burned to ash in a grotesque attempt to erase the past. The air grew thick with smoke from fires that burned not for heat, but for silence. The men of Action 1005, tasked with this macabre duty, worked until their faces blackened and their minds broke. When their task was complete, they too were executed, buried in the very earth they had disturbed. By the winter of 1944, the East was retreating beneath the boots of the Red Army. Villages once occupied by the SS were reclaimed by silence, then by Soviet soldiers, who arrived to document what the invaders had left behind. Cameras captured the pits, the bones, the personal artifacts, a doll's head, a cracked mirror, a wedding ring embedded in mud. The evidence could not be denied. Even as the Germans tried to obliterate the traces, the land itself testified. When the war finally ended, the names of the Einsatzgruppen appeared again, this time in courtrooms, in testimonies, in the archives of Nuremberg. The men who had once commanded life and death now stood behind glass, their faces pale and ordinary. They spoke of orders, of duty, of fear. They claimed ignorance, or necessity, or obedience. The judges listened, but the evidence was louder. The reports they themselves had written, the neat columns of figures, were read aloud until the silence in the courtroom grew unbearable. In the end, many were sentenced. Some were hanged. Others escaped, changing names, slipping into new lives in new countries. Justice, like the graves, was unevenly distributed. And yet, history does not forget. It carries the memory in whispers, in the soft rustle of birch leaves over forgotten earth. The Einsatzgruppen were not monsters born from myth, but men made monstrous by ideology, obedience, and the seduction of belonging. Their crimes were not acts of madness, but of method. That is what makes them unbearable to contemplate and essential to remember. In the stillness of those forests, where sunlight filters through branches and the ground swells gently where bones still lie, the story continues to speak. It warns, not in the language of history books, but in the quiet insistence of soil and silence, that every act of cruelty begins with a word, a justification, a duty performed too well, and that even the most ordinary men, given orders and fear enough to obey them, can turn the world to ash beneath the birch trees. The machinery of obedience. The war had grown tired of itself. By the winter of 1942, what had begun with trumpet blasts and parades had become a slow grind of mud, hunger, and exhaustion. Soldiers no longer marched with pride, but trudged through frost-bitten fields, their breath rising like smoke from the corpses left behind. Behind them, as always, came the black vehicles, unmarked, silent, efficient. The men inside did not carry rifles for battle. Their weapons were lists, orders, and an authority colder than the Russian winter itself. The Einsatzgruppen were no longer improvising murder, they had perfected it. What had started as spontaneous massacres had hardened into procedure. Every action had its form, its authorization, its schedule. Bureaucracy had taken the place of conscience. A single report from a regional commander might list 3,000 dead under the heading Operation Cleansing, the column beside it reading, "Completed successfully." Murder, translated into office language, ceased to feel like murder at all. In Berlin, the Reich main security office hummed with typewriters and telephones. Reinhard Heydrich's successor, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, presided over it like a man balancing ledgers. The numbers he reviewed were not factory quotas or rail schedules. They were human lives reduced to metrics. And yet, to those reading the documents, there was no contradiction. They believed themselves engineers of order, eliminating chaos in the form of people who did not belong to their new Europe. The murderers' greatest disguise was not their uniforms, but their paperwork. Down the chain of command, orders filtered into field posts and police headquarters, where officers read them without emotion. They had learned not to think in moral terms. To question meant disloyalty, and disloyalty was a death sentence. Each order was phrased with chilling precision. No mention of killing, only of action, resettlement, special treatment. Language became the first weapon, the alibi that made obedience possible, the bait. Men who received these directives could tell themselves they were merely implementing policy, not committing crimes. At the core of this machinery was a lie that the violence was necessary, that the victims were enemies, that obedience was virtue. This lie was not shouted or demanded. It was whispered through training manuals, uniforms, promotions, and the intoxicating feeling of being part of something vast and unstoppable. It is easy to underestimate how comforting obedience can be to those who fear responsibility. The Einsatzgruppen thrived not on fanaticism alone, but on the quiet surrender of moral agency. Each man found safety in the idea that someone else had already decided what was right. In occupied towns, this logic manifested as routine: a telegram from headquarters, a list from the local administration, a convoy prepared. The townspeople had learned to read the signs, the polished boots, the trucks parked near the town square, the German officer consulting a notebook before pointing toward the outskirts. The pattern was the same everywhere: the gathering, the waiting, the march. The victims were told to bring valuables, keys, documents. Many still believed, to the very end, that they were being relocated. Hope itself was used as an instrument of control. To the men giving the orders, these people were no longer individuals. They were numbers on a schedule to be processed before sundown. But something strange began to happen. As months of killing turned into years, the efficiency they sought started to corrode them from within. A few could no longer shoot straight. Some began trembling uncontrollably at the sound of gunfire. Others turned to alcohol until orders slurred into confusion. The SS called these symptoms Seelenkrankheit, sickness of the soul. But there was no remedy, only replacement. Those who faltered were reassigned or executed for cowardice. The machine tolerated no weakness, not even in its cogs. One officer, writing from Ukraine, in late 1942, confessed privately to a friend, "It is not the blood that disturbs me, but how quickly it stops disturbing. That is what frightens me most." He never mailed the letter. It was found after the war, hidden among routine field reports, its ink blurred by damp. It was a moment of accidental honesty, buried in a mountain of lies. Meanwhile, in the smoky rooms of Berlin, the system expanded. Eichmann's department refined transport logistics, ensuring trains ran on time from ghettos to killing grounds. Meetings at the Reich Ministry for the occupied Eastern Territories discussed demographic restructuring. Engineers improved the engines of gas vans for higher carbon monoxide output. Accountants debated fuel consumption against the number of passengers per trip. Each man played his part. None directly responsible, all essential. The genius of the system was that it divided responsibility so finely that no one ever had to feel guilty in full. In the field, this bureaucratic precision translated into horror. The soldiers knew the routine so well that they no longer needed orders. They arrived, they cordoned off, they gathered, they fired. Between shootings, they smoked and joked, trading watches or boots taken from the dead. They were young men, many barely 20, their humanity reduced to habit. Some wrote home describing difficult assignments, never elaborating. Wives received these letters with pride, unaware or unwilling to know what their husband's efficiency truly meant. But not all could bear it. A few deserted, running into forests to join partisans, or simply vanish. Their absence was never recorded, the paperwork simply moved on. Others asked for transfers, claiming illness. One such man, SS Oberscharführer Wilhelm K., was sent to a desk job after suffering a breakdown during a mass execution. His superior's report read, "Unfit for field work due to emotional instability." He survived the war, later testifying that he had tried to save lives by requesting reassignment. What he failed to mention was that before his breakdown, he had already killed thousands. By the beginning of 1943, the machine had reached its logical conclusion. Gas chambers in Poland replaced open-air shootings. The Einsatzgruppen were reassigned to new security duties, their experience in killing, now an asset for managing deportations and guarding camps. Many of them took pride in the transition. It felt more professional, less chaotic. They no longer had to pull triggers themselves. Now, they managed processes. The killing continued, but at a distance. It was modernized, industrialized, depersonalized, and that distance, that insulation from the act, made it infinitely easier to continue. In the ghettos, whispers spread faster than orders. People began to understand what resettlement really meant. In Warsaw, Lodz, Vilnius, families dug hiding places into walls and floors. Children were smuggled through sewers to the forests. Rabbis buried Torah scrolls beneath synagogues that would soon burn. In those final days before liquidation, the ghettos were filled not with panic, but with an eerie calm, the silence of people who had seen the pattern and knew the end of it. When the Red Army began to push westward, the machine faltered but did not stop. The Einsatzgruppen adapted again, this time to concealment. They dug up the graves they had filled, burned the remains, scattered ashes into rivers. The code name was Action 1005. Men who had once killed now desecrated the evidence of killing, their shovels digging into frozen soil thick with memory. They burned the bodies of victims and, when their work was complete, they were executed themselves. The machine erased its operators as easily as it had erased its targets, and yet the truth persisted. Documents survived, hidden in barns, buried in glass jars, smuggled out by partisans. A photographer in Riga, forced to record executions, buried his negatives beneath a tree. After the war, they were found intact. The images were blurred, grainy, but unmistakable. They showed men laughing beside pits, victims lined up in front of them, smoke curling in the distance. The photographs would become part of the evidence at Nuremberg, proof that obedience, when divorced from conscience, is the most dangerous weapon of all. In the aftermath, psychologists would search for explanations. How could ordinary men do such things? The question echoed through generations, echoing still. Some blamed ideology, others fear, ambition, or indoctrination. But perhaps the most terrifying truth was the simplest, that they did it because they were told to, and because no one told them to stop. The Einsatzgruppen were not demons from another world. They were clerks, teachers, mechanics, sons of barbers and farmers. They were men who found meaning in following orders, who mistook obedience for morality. And once they began, the structure of command ensured they could not and would not stop. Each man looked upward for permission, downward for execution. None looked inward, and so, as the machinery of obedience rolled on, fueled by signatures and stamps, the line between man and monster dissolved. The real horror of the Einsatzgruppen was not their cruelty, it was their normalcy. They proved that genocide requires not madness but method, not hatred alone but hierarchy. The greatest evil of the modern age was not chaos, but order, the order that made men kill efficiently, sleep soundly, and call it duty. When the snow fell again over the fields of the east, it covered everything: roads, trenches, ruins, and graves. For a time, it seemed to cleanse the landscape, to erase the scars. But beneath that white stillness, the machinery of obedience lay waiting, dormant but not destroyed. Because what the Einsatzgruppen had built was not just a system of killing, it was a template for how ordinary people, in any time or place, could be made, to serve horror by calling it necessity. And so, the snow kept falling. The wind whispered through the forests that once hid the convoys, and the world, remembering too late, began to understand. The real enemy had never been a nation, a race, or an army. It had been obedience itself, the quiet, unquestioning surrender of conscience to command. The ravine of echoes. The morning air was brittle and gray over Kiev, the mist rising like ghosts from the Dnieper River. Soldiers moved with mechanical rhythm, their boots crunching frost as they shouted orders through the stillness. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then was silent. The people gathered in the streets, Jews of Kiev, carrying what they could: coats, bundles, small parcels wrapped in twine. The notices had been clear enough. All Jews are to assemble with identification documents, valuables, and warm clothing. Failure to comply will result in severe punishment. Most thought they were being resettled. Some dared to hope they might even be exchanged for German prisoners. none could imagine what awaited them at the end of the road. It was September 29th, 1941, the day the earth would open its mouth at Babin Yar. They came by the thousands, a river of people flowing toward the edge of the city, men in long coats, women clutching children, the elderly leaning on canes or carried in makeshift carts. Some wore their Sabbath clothes, believing the Germans might respect dignity. Others brought bread or heirlooms, still bargaining with fate. Around them stood soldiers of the Einsatzgruppen, aided by Ukrainian police auxiliaries in blue-gray uniforms. The Germans watched with calm precision, ticking names off lists, directing people into columns. It had been rehearsed, every step calculated, every gesture efficient. The first checkpoint was by the railroad embankment. Luggage was piled neatly by nationality, valuables sorted, clothing stacked. A German officer inspected a suitcase stuffed with prosody, photographs, pulled one out, studied it a moment, and tossed it aside. The picture drifted onto the dirt, two children smiling before a schoolhouse, forever frozen in sunlight. The officer didn't look down. From there, the crowd was herded west toward the ravine. The sound of engines grew louder, the rumble of trucks, the metallic clatter of spades. The victims were ordered to undress, leaving their clothes in carefully labeled piles, men to one side, women and children to another. Soldiers barked commands in German and Ukrainian, their voices echoing off the limestone walls of the gorge. Some laughed, others smoked. One soldier hummed a song under his breath, an old Bavarian marching tune, its cheerful rhythm grotesquely out of place. The first groups were led to the edge. The ravine was deep, its sides steep and uneven. The victims were told to lie face down in layers. Machine guns rattled. The earth shuddered. Then another group was brought forward, ordered to climb over the bodies. The next volley of fire drowned out the sobs. Hour after hour the killing continued, methodical and uninterrupted. The guns jammed occasionally. Soldiers cursed, cleaned them, resumed. The smell of cordite and blood thickened in the air. By the time the sun began to set, the ravine was filled with bodies, tens of thousands of them. The executioners, spattered with blood and sweat, ate their evening meal by truck headlights. One officer noted in his report that the operation had been carried out without incident. Another recorded the exact figure: 33,771 Jews executed over 2 days. A bureaucratic miracle of efficiency. The report ended with a single word: erledigt. Completed. But the ravine did not forget. When night fell, a few survivors clawed their way out from beneath the weight of corpses. One was a teenage girl named Dina, who had fainted when the shooting began. She awoke, buried among the dead, her mother's hand still clutching her sleeve. She wriggled free, suffocating, digging through layers of flesh and soil until the night air struck her face. She crawled through the reeds and into the forest, where she lay until dawn. When she reached the nearest village, no one would let her in. They were terrified. She found shelter in a barn and stayed hidden until Soviet forces returned 2 years later. She would testify after the war, her voice shaking as she described the smell, the sounds, the silence afterward. Babin Yar was not unique. It was a symbol, a place where the entire logic of Nazi policy reached its purest, most horrifying form. No camps, no transports, no gas chambers, just men, guns, and the will to obey. Across the east, from Riga to Minsk, Smolensk to Dnipropetrovsk, the same scenes played out in forests, pits, and quarries. Every ravine became a grave, every field a monument of ash. The Einsatzgruppen had become experts in mass murder. They knew how to arrange victims efficiently, how to conserve ammunition, how to dig trenches to avoid cave-ins. Their reports read like engineering manuals. And yet, the men writing them were not born monsters. They had once been policemen, lawyers, clerks. They wrote to their families about missing home, about the cold, about promotions. They sent parcels filled with watches and rings stolen from the dead. In the evenings, they drank and sang songs around campfires. Some prayed before bed. The psychological toll, though often buried under alcohol and bravado, began to surface in quiet ways. Commanders requested rest leaves. Soldiers were found muttering to themselves, unable to sleep. One SS man confessed to a chaplain that he dreamed nightly of faces in the soil. The chaplain advised him to pray harder. Others responded differently by becoming more brutal, numbing themselves through excess violence. One officer wrote that after Babin Yar, killing became as simple as lighting a cigarette. In Berlin, the reports from Kiev were celebrated. Heydrich praised the Kompanov operation as an exemplary action, noting its smooth coordination between SS, police, and army units. Himmler forwarded commendations. The killings were data points in a larger strategy, proof that mass extermination could be done swiftly and secretly. The lessons learned in Kiev would be applied elsewhere. Within months, gas vans were dispatched to occupied territories, and construction began on fixed extermination sites. Babin Yar had been a prototype for industrial genocide, yet even as the Germans congratulated themselves, the ground beneath them began to shift, literally and figuratively. The ravine, filled with tens of thousands of decomposing bodies, started to heave. Gases from decay caused the soil to bubble and crack. Dogs gathered, drawn by the scent. Locals whispered that the earth was alive, that it groaned at night. For months afterward, villagers could hear strange noises from the pit. The Germans posted guards to keep people away, but rumors spread. The dead, it was said, refused to stay buried. When the Soviets retook Kiev in 1943, they found the ravine partly filled, partly open. Human bones protruded from the soil. Among the debris lay scraps of clothing, children's toys, spectacles, and documents. The investigators of the Soviet Extraordinary Commission photographed everything. Their report listed precise figures, described the method, cited witnesses. It was cold, clinical, factual. Yet even in their detachment, one could sense the enormity of what they were recording, a place where civilization had ceased to exist for 2 days. In post-war years, Babin Yar became a contested memory. The Soviets, reluctant to highlight the specifically Jewish nature of the victims, referred to them as Soviet citizens. The memorial, erected in 1976, bore no mention of Jews at all. It took decades before a proper monument acknowledged what had really happened there. In the meantime, the ravine remained a scar on the city, a place where grass refused to grow evenly, where the wind carried whispers of the past. For the men who had done the killing, life moved on. Some died at the front, others melted back into civilian life. A few faced justice at Nuremberg or later trials, though many escaped. Paul Blobel, the officer who commanded the Babin Yar massacre, would later oversee Action 1005, the operation to dig up and burn the corpses he had buried. He tried to erase his own crime, but history preserved it. At his trial, he stood calm and expressionless, insisting he had merely followed orders. He was executed in 1951. The tragedy of Babin Yar is not just in its scale but in its ordinariness. There was no grand theater, no infernal machinery, just rifles, shovels, and silence. It showed that the Holocaust did not begin in gas chambers. It began with obedience and apathy, with ordinary men accepting that cruelty was their duty. The ravine became a mirror reflecting humanity's darkest capacity, to turn murder into routine, to make horror procedural. Today, visitors to the site walk quietly among trees. The city hums beyond the memorial, unaware of the bones beneath the soil. Children play in nearby parks. The air is thick with the scent of flowers, yet beneath the sweetness lies the faint tang of iron, as though the earth still remembers. The wind that moves through Babin Yar carries no words, only a question that has outlived empires, ideologies, and men. How could they? The answer is buried there too, under layers of soil and history, whispered by the dead to those willing to listen. It says, because they were told to, because they obeyed, because the silence of bystanders made obedience easier, And so the ravine of echoes remains not only as a graveyard of the murdered, but as a warning to the living. The boots that marched away from Kiev in 1941 believed their work was done. They were wrong. Babin Yar never ended. It lives wherever memory fades, wherever obedience outweighs conscience, wherever men convince themselves that cruelty is duty. The guns have fallen silent, but the echo still speaks. The architects of annihilation. Berlin in early 1942 pulsed with a quiet tension, a deceptive calm that hung over the city like fog before a storm. Beneath the marble facades and the chatter of cafes, the heart of something monstrous beat in rhythm with typewriters, railway timetables, and bureaucratic signatures. The war was not only being fought with tanks and artillery anymore, it was being fought with forms, memorandums, and trains. In offices where sunlight filtered through high windows, men in crisp uniforms plotted a new kind of destruction. They were not soldiers on a battlefield. They were architects of annihilation. Reinhard Heydrich, the tall, sharp-featured blonde beast of the Reich, stood before his office window on Prinz Albrechtstrasse, surveying the wintry streets of Berlin. He appeared the model of efficiency, calm, polished, immaculate, but behind those cold eyes lived a machine. Heydrich's genius lay in his ability to translate ideology into process, to turn murder into method. To him, extermination was a problem of organization, not morality. When he summoned his colleagues to a quiet villa by Lake Wannsee on January 20th, 1942, there was no overt sense of dread. The meeting was presented as routine and administrative coordination. The villa's snow-covered gardens looked peaceful, the lake frozen and still. Yet inside those elegant walls, the most lethal policy in modern history was about to be finalized. 15 men gathered around the table that morning. They were not executioners or soldiers caked in mud and blood. They were bureaucrats, lawyers, economists, and police officials, civilized men, well-educated and polite. Coffee was poured. Cigarettes were lit. Laughter broke the morning's chill. Reinhard Heydrich began with data, reading figures as if discussing an industrial project. 11 million Jews, he said calmly, reside within the sphere of German influence. His voice was smooth, professional, detached. He spoke of deportations to the east, of processing, of natural diminution through labor. The men nodded, scribbled notes, and asked logistical questions. Nobody said the word murder. They didn't have to. Everyone knew. The minutes of that meeting, the now infamous Wannsee Protocol, were a masterpiece of euphemism. Words like evacuation, special treatment, and appropriate handling concealed a blueprint for extermination. The language of genocide was bureaucratic, polite, and terrifyingly precise. Within 2 hours, a continent's death sentence had been signed, sealed, and scheduled. The men shook hands, collected their hats and coats, and left for lunch, discussing their families and evening engagements as though nothing significant had occurred. But they had just transformed mass murder from an improvised campaign of shootings into a centrally administered industrial process. The reports from the East had already been pouring into Berlin for months, daily logs from the Einsatzgruppen detailing special actions. They were written with chilling composure. One entry read, Einsatzkommando 3 executed 2,214 persons today. Weather cold, morale satisfactory. Another noted that task completed after killing thousands of civilians. To Heydrich, these reports were simply metrics. He read them methodically, annotating suggestions in the margins for improving coordination or reducing ammunition expenditure. The killing was data, and data could always be optimized. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, also read those reports, but his reactions were different. Not moral, never moral, but pragmatic. The shooting of tens of thousands was inefficient, costly in ammunition, and corrosive to his men's mental health. During a visit to Minsk, he had witnessed an execution firsthand. The gunfire, the screams, the collapse of bodies into the pits, it all overwhelmed him. Pale and trembling, he had turned away and vomited. Yet instead of questioning the act, he questioned the method. The killings must continue, he decided, but they must be made cleaner, less stressful for the perpetrators. Out of this grotesque search for efficiency was born the idea of mechanized murder. The answer came in the form of gas vans, trucks, modified to redirect exhaust fumes into sealed compartments. Victims were told they were being transported to new work sites. As the vehicles drove into the forests, their engines roared louder, and within 15 minutes, everyone inside was dead. When the truck doors opened, silence spilled out, along with the fumes. The bodies were dragged into pits and covered in lime. Reports to Berlin called these innovations quieter, more efficient, and psychologically preferable. The language of mass murder had evolved once again. At the same time, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels kept the home front intoxicated with hatred and fear. Newspapers ran articles about Jewish parasites and Bolshevik conspiracies. The radio droned endlessly about cleansing Europe from infection. The lies spread easily because they found eager hosts. Ordinary Germans, struggling with rationing and war fatigue, were told their suffering was caused by invisible enemies, and they believed it. Trains departed from cities daily, packed with deportees, while nearby families went about their lives. In Berlin, children skipped to school past posters that promised a new Europe. Housewives queued for bread. Soldiers returned on leave and spoke little of what they had seen. Silence blanketed the country, thick as smoke. Among the silent was Adolf Eichmann, Heydrich's chosen organizer of Jewish affairs. Thin, bespectacled, polite, he was the embodiment of ordinary evil. Eichmann had no appetite for blood. He preferred schedules, routes, and timetables. His office in Berlin displayed a vast map of Europe crisscrossed with rail lines, each representing a deportation corridor. From Paris, Vienna, Amsterdam, Prague, and Salonika, trains converged eastward toward the black heart of occupied Poland. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. Each departure was scheduled, each carriage accounted for, each soul reduced to a number. When asked later if he hated Jews, Eichmann replied indifferently, "My feelings are irrelevant. I fulfilled my duty." The deportations became an engineering triumph of precision. Conductors blew whistles, engines hissed, and the carriages rolled east, always on time. The trains were never late. Bureaucratic perfection turned to moral vacuum. What had once been an administrative challenge had now become the central function of the Reich's machinery. The camps evolved quickly. At Chelmno, exhaust fumes were used to suffocate victims. At Belzec and Sobibor, carbon dioxide filled fake shower chambers. By the time Auschwitz perfected the use of Zyklon B gas, the process had been reduced to minutes, 15 for killing, 30 for ventilation, an hour for cremation. Bodies became ash. Ash became dust. And dust became statistics. Each death was recorded, filed, and summarized. This was genocide as procedure. The system worked only because it drew strength from civilization's normality. Engineers designed crematoria with improved ventilation systems. Rail officials managed timetables that ensured uninterrupted deportations. Accountants calculated costs per deportee. Even architects contributed, refining building designs to maximize throughput. None of them ever held a gun, none of them ever screamed, but their hands were soaked in the same blood. Letters between officers and their families revealed the surreal duality of their lives. One commander wrote after overseeing a mass execution, "The children looked lovely this morning. I feel at peace." His wife replied, "You are a hero, defending our nation." The human mind, it seemed, could reconcile tenderness and atrocity when ideology made both feel righteous. Even culture lent its grace to the enterprise. Universities taught racial hygiene as a legitimate science. Artists painted Aryan idylls while factories built gas chambers. Poets glorified destiny. Philosophers debated purity and will. The same civilization that produced symphonies and cathedrals was now producing ash and bone. This was not barbarism from without. It was order turned inward, logic corrupted, modernity weaponized. When Heydrich was assassinated in Prague in 1942, his funeral became a theater of grandeur. Himmler called him the man who solved the Jewish question. Hitler praised him as the ideal National Socialist. The machine mourned its perfect cog, but its gears did not stop turning. His successor, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, continued the program seamlessly. Orders kept flowing from Berlin. Reports kept returning from the field. Each bore signatures and stamps, crisp as death warrants. Yet cracks had begun to appear. As the Red Army advanced westward and Germany's fortunes waned, unease spread through the hierarchy. The question was no longer how to kill, but how to hide. Soviet investigators were discovering mass graves, and German command feared exposure. Thus began Action 1005, the campaign to exhume and burn the bodies, to erase evidence of murder. The same engineers who had built crematoria now designed machines to crush bones. The same clerks who tallied deaths now tallied the destruction of corpses. The drive for efficiency persisted, even in covering up genocide. Through it all, the architects of annihilation remained composed. They did not shout or boast. They spoke in the cool tones of reason and necessity. They never used the language of hatred, only of duty and order. They filed reports with clean fingernails and steady hands. They dined with their families, read poetry, and slept soundly. They were civilized men who had learned to make evil sound rational. That was their triumph, and humanity's damnation. They proved that civilization does not need to collapse for genocide to happen. It only needs to obey. The murderers did not roar like beasts. They whispered like clerks. They didn't wield axes. They wielded pens. The rooms where they planned were well lit and quiet. The papers they signed were smooth and white. And yet, on those pages, the fate of millions was sealed forever. This was the true horror of the Reich. Not the monsters in uniform, but the men in offices who turned slaughter into administration, who reduced morality to arithmetic, and who built an empire of death with the tools of order and reason. The world would remember their crimes, but few would grasp their lesson, that the greatest threat to humanity is not chaos, it is obedience made efficient, the machinery of silence. By 1943, Europe had become a continent of whispers. The trains still rolled east, the reports still arrived on time, and the offices of the Reich still hummed with the sound of typewriters hammering out death disguised as administration. The killing had become ordinary, mechanical, perfected. It was no longer the work of fanatics alone, but the collective rhythm of a society that had learned how to murder efficiently and speak of it as policy. The machinery of genocide no longer relied on noise or chaos. It relied on silence. That silence began in small ways. A train station worker signing off a manifest without reading the destination. A telegraph clerk transmitting coded orders without asking what special transport meant. A farmer seeing smoke rising from the forest beyond his fields and saying nothing. The silence grew contagious, spreading through towns and cities until it became the air itself. Thick, invisible, and suffocating. People knew something was happening, but they did not want to know everything. In a regime built on the greatness creed, fear, curiosity was dangerous. Better to look away, better to keep quiet. Inside the ghettos, however, silence was impossible. The walls of brick and barbed wire could not muffle the cries of hunger, nor the shuffle of starving feet on cobblestone. The largest ghettos, Warsaw, Łódź, Kraków, had become graveyards of the living. In Warsaw, 500,000 Jews were crammed into an area barely 3% the size of the city. Disease spread faster than food. Entire families vanished overnight, taken for resettlement. Posters announced deportations in the neutral tone of civic order, but everyone understood their meaning. People began disappearing by the thousands, their names erased from lists, their homes emptied and sealed. Those who remained learned to speak softly, to move like shadows, to hope without believing. The sound of boots became a language of its own. Heavy boots meant searches, roundups, or executions. Light boots, sometimes, meant smugglers bringing bread through the sewers. Children learned to distinguish them before they could read. In this world, hope was traded in crumbs literally. A crust of bread could buy another day of life. Yet amid the starvation and disease, there was something more defiant than despair: memory. People began to write on scraps of paper, on walls, in diaries buried beneath ruins. They recorded names, dates, songs, prayers. They wrote not for the living, but for whoever might come after, for whoever would dig through the ashes and ask, "What happened here?" The ghettos were not just holding pens, they were laboratories of resistance. Smuggled radios carried news from the outside world, often distorted but enough to feed hope. Underground schools continued to teach children forbidden subjects. Rabbis held secret services. Musicians carved violins out of scavenged wood and played symphonies of mourning. Even in their captivity, people asserted the one freedom left to them: the refusal to forget who they were. In Łódź, the ghetto was run by Mordechai Chaim Rumkowski, a man both tragic and controversial. Appointed by the Germans as head of the Jewish Council, he believed that obedience and labor could preserve life. "Our only way is work," he told the starving crowds, insisting that productivity would make the Jews indispensable. Factories were built, sewing uniforms, repairing boots, manufacturing tools for the Wehrmacht. For a time, it seemed to work. Deportations slowed. The ghetto endured. But endurance was an illusion. In 1942, the Germans demanded the surrender of all children under 10. Rumkowski stood before his people in the square and spoke words that history would never forgive. "Give me your children." He was crying as he said it, but the trains left anyway. Even in hell, there were degrees. Some ghettos were annihilated quickly, others lingered, suspended between life and death. Warsaw was both the largest and the last to fall. By April 1943, rumors spread that liquidation was imminent. The remaining Jews, around 50,000, had nothing left to lose. In underground bunkers and sewers, they gathered weapons smuggled in by the Polish resistance. A few pistols, grenades, and Molotov cocktails. On April 19th, when the SS entered the ghetto to begin deportations, they were met not with submission, but with gunfire. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising lasted nearly a month. It was hopeless from the start. But that was the point. Fighters like Mordechai Anielewicz knew they could not win. Their goal was not victory, it was dignity. They fought for the right to choose how they would die. For weeks, the Germans struggled to crush the rebellion. Flames consumed entire streets. The smell of smoke and death filled the city. Civilians were burned alive in bunkers. When the uprising was finally over, the ghetto no longer existed. A vast ruin remained, smoldering like a wound. SS General Jürgen Stroop reported to his superiors in chilling simplicity, "The Jewish quarter of Warsaw is no more." Beyond Warsaw, other uprisings flickered and died. Treblinka, Sobibor, Vilna. Each one a cry into the void, brief and doomed but unforgettable. The Nazis recorded them as disturbances. Historians would later call them miracles. While Europe's ghettos burned, the machinery behind their destruction remained disturbingly calm. In Berlin, trains were still scheduled to the minute. In Lublin, Operation Reinhard camps continued their slaughter at full capacity. At Belzec, 10,000 people were killed per day. At Treblinka, the figure reached 15,000. The guards worked in shifts. The victims arrived in silence, stepped into what they were told were showers, and disappeared. Their belongings were sorted, catalogued, and sent back to Germany. Every piece of clothing, every ring, every tooth. Efficiency was worshipped as virtue. Yet even this industrial rhythm of death could not exist without human hands. Those hands belonged not only to Germans, but to Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Poles, and others who collaborated for pay, ideology, or revenge. They manned checkpoints, loaded trains, guarded camps. Some did it out of hatred, others out of hunger. Many simply followed orders. Collaboration was rarely born from conviction. It was born from convenience. Silence, again, was the currency of survival. For every collaborator, there was a neighbor who said nothing. For every man who pulled a trigger, there was another who closed his door and pretended not to hear. The machinery of death needed both the actor and the bystander. Without one, the other could not exist. In Germany itself, the public version of events was a grotesque masquerade. Newspapers spoke of evacuations to new settlements. Posters declared that Jews were being resettled for labor. People wanted to believe these lies because they made life easier. In Hamburg, a teacher told her students that their Jewish classmates had moved to work farms. In Munich, a baker who once supplied bread to the synagogue began baking twice as much, but for different customers, German soldiers. In Dresden, a young woman received a letter from her fiancé on the Eastern Front. "It's hard work here," he wrote, "but necessary. We are clearing the land." He didn't mention what he was clearing it of. The church, too, wrestled with silence. Some priests and pastors protested, quietly, cautiously. A few were imprisoned or executed. But most found ways to reconcile faith with fear. They prayed for peace, but avoided naming its enemies. They spoke of sin, but not of slaughter. The pulpit, like the press, became another part of the machinery, its silence giving moral cover to the unspeakable. And yet, cracks in that silence began to show. In 1942, reports reached the Vatican describing systematic extermination. British intelligence intercepted German transmissions about mass shootings. The Polish underground smuggled eyewitness accounts to London. But the Allies, though horrified, hesitated to act. Military strategy took precedence. The war had to be won before justice could be served. By the time the first concentration camp was liberated, millions were already ash. In the East, the work of killing was beginning to exhaust even its perpetrators. The men of the Einsatzgruppen had long since abandoned any illusion of purpose. They drank heavily, they argued, some broke down entirely. One officer wrote home, "It is not the bodies that haunt me, it is the silence afterward." Others embraced the violence, boasting in letters of their efficiency. But even among the most hardened killers, cracks appeared. The machinery they served demanded their humanity as fuel, and slowly it was burning them out. Meanwhile, the earth itself began to betray them. The graves were too shallow, the bodies too many. Wolves and dogs unearthed the dead. The air stank of decay. Villagers whispered of fields that moaned in the night. In 1943, the SS launched Action 1005, the systematic exhumation and incineration of corpses, to destroy evidence. The same men who had killed were now ordered to dig up what they had buried. Flames rose again from the same ravines, this time carrying ash instead of breath. It was the final act of the machinery of silence, an attempt to erase the sound of the dead. But erasure was impossible. Some survived barely. A child who hid beneath bodies and crawled out after nightfall. A woman who escaped from a train by prying loose a floorboard. A man who joined the partisans and spent the rest of the war hunting his hunters. Their testimonies would become cracks in the silence, splinters of truth that no bureaucracy could suppress. As 1944 approached, the silence began to tremble. The Red Army was advancing westward, and the Nazis could feel the weight of their crimes pressing down. Camps were dismantled, prisoners marched deeper into the Reich on death marches that killed thousands more. Yet even in retreat, the machinery continued to function. The trains still ran. The orders still came. The silence still held thin, trembling, but unbroken. And then, one day, it didn't. The first Allied soldiers to enter Majdanek in July 1944 walked through gates expecting a labor camp. What they found was a city of the dead. Ashes filled the air, scattered across fields like snow. Warehouses overflowed with shoes, glasses, human hair. The silence of years broke open in a single collective gasp. Cameras recorded the horror. Reporters wrote words that still failed to contain it. The machinery of silence had finally stopped, not because it had chosen to, but because there was no one left to keep it running. Yet, even then, denial began its work. Some refused to believe. Others said the reports were exaggerated. Silence, once broken, began to rebuild itself in new forms: political, national, convenient. It would take decades to dismantle it entirely, and even then, parts of it would remain. The machinery of silence had done more than kill it, had taught a terrible lesson, that evil does not require shouting or rage. It requires compliance, indifference, the quiet ticking of a clock as trains depart for nowhere. It requires people who believe that their silence is safety, that looking away is innocence. It requires the world to keep its voice down until it's too late. By the war's end, Europe was no longer a continent of whispers but of echoes. The silence that had once protected the killers now haunted the living, in the ruins of cities, in the ashes of camps, in the hearts of survivors. The echoes remained a soundless chorus of all that had been lost, waiting for someone, anyone, to listen. Shadows of the West. By the end of 1943, the tide of war had shifted, though few yet dared to say it aloud. The Wehrmacht had lost Stalingrad. The Red Army was advancing inch by bloody inch across the vast plains it had once surrendered. The Allies bombed Germany by night and day, turning industrial cities into pyres that mirrored the infernos the Nazis had once set upon others. Yet in the occupied West France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and beyond the shadows of the Reich still stretched long, and beneath their darkness, the machinery of genocide continued its quiet, methodical work. The Einsatzgruppen had been born on the Eastern Front, forged in the fires of ideological war. But by 1943, their methods had metastasized westward. What began as mobile killing units now existed in bureaucratic form, woven into every corner of Nazi administration. The death factories of Poland, Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka had become the final destination for a network of police, informants, and railway officials spanning the continent. Every timetable, every border check, every ledger entry was a cog in the same infernal machine. France, once seen as a bastion of culture and civilization, was now a landscape of betrayal and complicity. The Vichy regime, under Marshal Philippe Pétain, prided itself on maintaining French honor while collaborating with the occupiers. In truth, its honor was buried under lists of names, of addresses, of birth dates, of faiths. The Jews of France, long integrated into the fabric of society, suddenly found themselves divided by categories: foreign and native, protected and unprotected. Bureaucracy became a weapon sharper than any blade. In the summer of 1942, the Vichy police organized what would become the largest mass arrest in French history, the Vel de Hiv Roundup. At dawn, on July 16th, 9,000 officers fanned out across Paris. Doors were pounded open, papers checked, families torn from beds. Over 13,000 Jews were arrested, including more than 4,000 children. They were herded into the Velodrome de Hiver, a vast indoor cycling stadium that reeked of sweat and fear. For 5 days, they were held there without food, water, or sanitation. The air was thick with the sound of sobbing and the stench of human misery. Outside, Parisians went about their day. Some watched from windows, others drew their curtains. The trains that left afterward carried no soldiers, no weapons, only civilians, packed like freight, bound for Auschwitz. Few in Paris spoke of it afterward. The newspapers printed vague reports of transfers. The police officers who had carried out the arrests were told they had served France. The silence was suffocating, but it was familiar. Collaboration had always worn the mask of duty. In Amsterdam, the process was slower, but no less thorough. The Dutch, efficient and orderly, became unwilling facilitators of their own annihilation. Registration laws were obeyed with precision. Jewish citizens filled out forms identifying themselves, believing compliance might spare them. It didn't. Deportations began in earnest in 1942. From the Westerbork transit camp, trains departed twice a week to Auschwitz and Sobibor. Among those forced aboard was a Prosibord Ubdai, teenage girl named Anne Frank, whose words would one day speak for millions who never had the chance. But in that moment, she was only one among countless voices silenced. Belgium, Denmark, Norway. The pattern repeated, though with variations of courage and complicity. In Denmark, something miraculous happened. When the Germans ordered the deportation of the country's 7,800 Jews in October 1943, word spread quickly. In a coordinated act of defiance, Danish citizens smuggled nearly all of them across the Øresund Strait to neutral Sweden. Fishermen, teachers, priests, ordinary people risked imprisonment and death to save neighbors they barely knew. It was proof that silence was not inevitable, that moral courage could still flicker even in the darkest night. Yet Denmark was the exception, not the rule. Across most of occupied Europe, fear proved stronger than conscience. In Germany itself, the persecution had become invisible. The cities were scarred by Allied bombs, and propaganda told citizens that Jews had been resettled in the East. People no longer asked where they had gone. Some whispered suspicions but pushed them aside. After all, what could one person do? That phrase, "What could I do?" became the most common justification of the age, a soft blanket of denial covering a mountain of ash. Meanwhile, in the East, the killing reached its final industrial form. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the chimneys no longer stopped smoking. The crematoria ran day and night, their flames lighting up the Polish sky. Sonderkommando units, Jewish prisoners forced to handle corpses, worked until they themselves were executed and replaced. The process had achieved a terrible perfection. Transports arrived, selections were made, bodies incinerated, possessions sorted, each step timed to the minute. SS officers kept meticulous records, logging every shipment of human beings as though counting cattle. Yet even in this kingdom of death, the machinery began to falter. The influx of prisoners exceeded the capacity of the crematoria. Piles of corpses rose faster than they could be burned. The stench carried for miles, sickening nearby villagers and forcing the SS to expand burial pits. Himmler grew nervous not from conscience, but from inefficiency. The work, he said, must remain invisible. But by 1944, invisibility was no longer possible. Inside the camps, rumors spread that the Allies were advancing. Prisoners whispered of battles won at Stalingrad and Kursk, of American landings in Italy. For the first time in years, hope stirred a dangerous thing in places built to extinguish it. Hope led to planning. Planning led to resistance. At Sobibor, in October 1943, 600 prisoners staged a revolt, led by Alexander Pechersky, a Soviet Jewish officer. They lured SS guards into ambushes, killed them with stolen weapons, and stormed the gates. 300 escaped into the surrounding forests. Most were hunted down and killed, but 50 survived until war's end. It was a victory measured not in numbers but in defiance, a single spark against the machinery of annihilation. In Treblinka, another uprising erupted that same year. Prisoners set fire to the camp, destroyed documents, and fled into the woods. The SS crushed the revolt, but the damage was done. Treblinka ceased operations soon after, its grounds plowed over to conceal the evidence. Yet the earth refused to forget. Even years later, grass grew unevenly where the bodies lay. As the Reich crumbled, the Nazi elite turned inward. Himmler, once so assured, now obsessed over maintaining control. In his speeches to SS officers, he spoke not of victory, but of honor. "We have carried out this most difficult task," he told them, "and we have remained decent." Decent. The word echoed through the ranks like a prayer uttered by men drowning in guilt they could not name. They told themselves that their crimes were duty, their murders a burden carried for the fatherland. In their delusion, they imagined themselves heroes of order in a collapsing world. But order itself was collapsing. Allied forces pushed into Italy. The Eastern Front disintegrated under Soviet offensives. In occupied France, resistance groups that had once operated in shadows now fought openly. Bridges were sabotaged, railways destroyed, collaborators executed. The Gestapo responded with ruthless reprisals. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were wiped out. In June 1944, after an ambush on German soldiers, SS troops surrounded the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane. They separated the men from the women and children, locked the men in barns, and set them on fire. The women and children were herded into the church, where grenades and machine guns turned the sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. 642 people died in a single day. The village was never rebuilt. Its ruins stand today, silent witness to what obedience to evil can achieve. Even as defeat loomed, the Nazis refused to stop killing. In Hungary, Adolf Eichmann personally oversaw the deportation of over 400,000 Jews to Auschwitz between May and July 1944, an operation so rapid that it stunned even his superiors. The trains arrived faster than the ovens could burn their cargo. For 3 months, the Hungarian countryside became a conveyor belt to death. By the time it ended, nearly half of Hungary's Jewish population had vanished. Meanwhile, within Germany, the propaganda machine intensified. Goebbels preached of total war, of sacrifice, of eternal struggle. Civilians dug trenches, collected scrap metal, and listened to the radio for news of miraculous new weapons that would reverse their fate. But beneath the slogans lay quiet dread. Letters from soldiers spoke of retreat and ruin. The Reich's cities lay in ashes. Food was scarce, morale lower still, and yet the deportation lists continued. In the midst of this disintegration, a few acts of conscience emerged too late to save millions, but enough to show that moral clarity still flickered amid despair. In Berlin, a factory owner named Oskar Schindler used his influence and bribery to protect over 1,000 Jewish workers, moving them from concentration camps to his factory under the pretense of war production. Each name on his list was a life pulled from the abyss. In his drunken evenings, Schindler wept, cursing himself for not saving more. His story would survive not because it was typical, but because it was rare. As 1,944 turned to 1,945, the Allied armies closed in from east and west. The Nazi Empire that had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga began to implode under its own weight. Himmler ordered the destruction of camps to hide evidence. Trains carrying prisoners westward became death marches, as thousands died of hunger, exposure, or execution along the roads. The guards who had once strutted with confidence now fled in terror, burning documents and shooting witnesses. The Western Allies, Americans, British, Canadians liberated camps like Buchenwald and Dachau. What they found defied imagination. Skeletal survivors, heaps of corpses, warehouses filled with human hair and children's shoes. Soldiers, accustomed to battle, hardened by years of killing, wept openly. Generals turned away, unable to look. "We knew evil existed," one wrote, "but not like this." In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, liberation brought joy mingled with shame. Collaborators were rounded up. Women accused of sleeping with Germans had their heads shaved in public squares. But the reckoning could not erase what had been done. The trains had left too long ago. The children were gone. The names on the lists were never coming home. By the spring of 1945, the shadows of the West began to recede, revealing the ruins they had concealed. Europe lay shattered, a continent of ghosts. Cities reduced to rubble, fields to graves, hearts to silence. The machinery of genocide had been stopped, but not destroyed. Its blueprints, obedience, bureaucracy, dehumanization, remained, waiting for another age to rediscover them. When the Allied troops forced local villagers to walk through the camps, many covered their faces, saying they had never known. Perhaps they hadn't known everything, but they had known enough. Silence had been their defense, and now it became their condemnation. The West had survived, but survival was not innocence. The shadows it cast would linger long after the last shots were fired, whispering a question that would echo through generations. What would you have done? The question had no easy answer. It still doesn't. And that is why history must never sleep. The collapse of the Reich. By the beginning of 1945, the empire that had once imagined itself eternal was collapsing in on itself like a dying star. What had begun as a vision of a 1,000-year Reich had burned itself out in barely 12. Its cities were smoldering carcasses, its armies broken and retreating, its leaders haunted by ghosts of their own creation. The walls were closing in from every direction, the Soviets from the east, the Americans and British from the west, the French resistance rising from within. But even as the Reich crumbled, even as defeat became inevitable, its killing machine did not slow. It accelerated. The philosophy of annihilation that had guided the Nazi project from the beginning, the eradication of those deemed unworthy of life, did not end when victory slipped from their grasp. It intensified, fueled by a toxic mixture of delusion, desperation, and pride. The closer death came for Germany, the more determined its architects became to drag millions down with them. Berlin itself, once the proud capital of European modernity, had become a city of ruins. Allied bombings had reduced entire districts to dust. Streets once filled with laughter and light, now echoed with the shuffle of refugees and the distant thud of artillery. Food was almost non-existent. Civilians huddled in basements, surviving on watery soup and scraps from ration bins. Mothers buried their children in gardens, then fled before another air raid could bury them too. And above all of it, the propaganda speakers still played promising victory, warning of betrayal, and urging every man, woman, and child to fight to the last breath. In the Reich Chancellery, Hitler refused to accept reality. His armies existed now mostly on paper. Divisions listed in daily reports were often no more than a few hundred exhausted men with barely functioning weapons. Yet he still issued orders as though he commanded legions. Maps were unrolled before him daily, marked with arrows of red and blue, but the lines no longer represented armies, only illusions. The Führer's court had become a theater of denial, where generals nodded along to madness because to disagree was treason. He raged at his subordinates, accusing them of cowardice and betrayal. To him, the German people had failed him, not the other way around. He ordered the destruction of Germany's remaining infrastructure, bridges, railways, power plants, under the Nero Decree, so that nothing would be left for the Allies. If the Reich was to die, it would die in fire, and its ashes would bury the unworthy. But some commanders quietly refused. They had seen enough. They disobeyed, sabotaged orders, or simply delayed them, hoping to save what could be saved. In that defiance, small, fragile, and too late, flickered the faintest ember of humanity. As the Soviets pressed through Poland and into Germany, they uncovered the true breadth of the horror that had been hidden behind the front lines. Town by town, forest by forest, they discovered the remnants of the Einsatzgruppen's work: mass graves, charred bones, twisted wire, the faint smell of death that lingered in the frozen soil. Entire villages had been wiped from the map, their names surviving only in confiscated German reports, and the whispered memories of the few who had escaped. Soviet war correspondents documented everything: the exhumations, the skeletal remains of children, the bullet casings, littering pits large enough to swallow thousands. The photographs would later stun the world, but at that moment they were simply proof of what was already known. The Third Reich had been built on murder. As the Red Army advanced, German civilians fled westward by the millions. The roads were seas of misery, endless columns of carts, wagons, and broken-down vehicles carrying everything people could not bear to leave behind. Families froze in snow-covered ditches, strafed by aircraft, crushed beneath the chaos of retreat. And mingled among them were those with darker secrets: former SS men, Gestapo officers, and Einsatzgruppen veterans, who now wore civilian coats and carried forged papers, hoping to vanish into the flood of humanity. They burned their uniforms, destroyed documents, and rehearsed new identities. Some had memorized their alibis so perfectly that even years later, under interrogation, they would speak their lies with the calmness of truth. But others didn't make it far. The Soviets, enraged by what they found in places like Majdanek and Auschwitz, showed no mercy. SS prisoners were executed on sight, often by the same peasants whose families they had slaughtered. For every village burned, a dozen Germans were hanged from its remaining trees. Revenge had come brutal, indiscriminate, and unstoppable. The cycle of death continued, now reversed, consuming perpetrators and innocents alike. In the West, Allied forces approached the Rhine. American soldiers who had grown numb to combat were unprepared for what they discovered as they moved deeper into Germany. At Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, they found piles of bodies stacked like firewood, their faces frozen in the final expressions of agony. General Eisenhower himself visited the camp. He did not speak. He simply ordered every nearby German civilian to walk through and witness what had been done in their name. "Let the world see," he said. "Let no one ever say this was not true." In Berlin, the end came with thunder. By April 1945, the city was encircled by Soviet artillery. Day and night, shells rained down, reducing what little still stood to rubble. In the underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler sat pale and trembling, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Around him, a shrinking circle of loyalists clung to fantasies. Joseph Goebbels assured him that the Western Allies would soon turn against the Soviets and join Germany against communism. Others whispered of secret weapons, miracle divisions, divine intervention. But outside the bunker walls, the truth screamed through every explosion. It was over. In those final days, the killing did not stop. Orders were still carried out. Prisoners were still shot, even as the SS fled. In the camps that remained, guards massacred inmates to erase evidence. At Dachau, thousands were marched toward the Alps in what became known as death marches. Men and women dropped from exhaustion and were shot where they fell. The road to liberation was lined with corpses. Inside Auschwitz, what little remained of the operation was hastily dismantled. The crematoria were blown up, the gas chambers demolished, but the evidence was indestructible. The ashes in the soil, the hair stored in warehouses, the thousands of shoes, each pair once belonging to a person with a name, a face, a life, were impossible to erase. When Soviet soldiers entered the camp on January 27, 1945, they found 7,000 survivors too weak to stand. They also found warehouses filled with human belongings, suitcases labeled in careful handwriting, wedding rings, children's toys. The soldiers wept openly. Some prayed, others could only stare. The words came later, haltingly, from those who survived. "We were liberated, but we were not free." As Germany collapsed, Himmler made one last attempt to salvage his own life. He approached the Swedish Red Cross, offering to negotiate surrender in exchange for leniency. But when Hitler learned of his betrayal, he stripped Himmler of all titles and banished him from the Reich. The man who had orchestrated the machinery of death was now an outcast in the empire he helped build. Disguised as a sergeant, he tried to flee north, but was captured by British forces in May. When they discovered his identity, Himmler bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule and died instantly. His last act, like his life, was cowardice. Others followed similar paths. Goebbels poisoned his 6 children before taking his own life with his wife. Göring surrendered to the Americans, dreaming of defending himself at a trial that would become infamous. Hitler, faced with the prospect of capture, put a gun to his head on April 30, 1945, ending the life that had destroyed tens of millions. The bunker fell silent. The Reich had devoured itself. The news spread quickly. In cities across Europe, people poured into the streets, cheering, crying, embracing strangers. But the joy was tempered by grief. For many, there was no one left to celebrate with. Families had vanished, towns erased. The end of the war did not bring closure, only realization. The enormity of the crime became clearer each day as Allied troops liberated more camps. Bergen-Belsen, Ravensbrück, Mauthausen. Each name became synonymous with horror. Even hardened soldiers vomited at the sight. Some photographers refused to continue documenting. It felt wrong, one wrote, to capture hell through a lens. In the months that followed, Germany became a land of ghosts. The survivors wandered through its ruins, searching for family, for answers, for meaning. Displaced persons camps sprang up across Europe, housing millions who had nowhere to return to. Among them were Jews from Poland, Hungary, Romania. The few who had outlasted the death machine. They carried nothing but memories and numbers tattooed into their flesh. The Allied powers divided the defeated nation into zones of occupation. Denazification began a massive effort to remove Nazi influence from every aspect of life. Trials were organized to bring the perpetrators to justice. But justice, like everything after the war, was uneven. Some of the worst killers were dead by their own hands. Others vanished into anonymity, hiding in plain sight. The survivors of the Einsatzgruppen, the few who could be identified, faced trial at Nuremberg. 24 were charged with crimes against humanity. 14 were sentenced to death. The rest received prison sentences, many of which were later reduced. Some walked free within a decade, living out quiet lives under new names. It was an imperfect reckoning, but it was something. For the first time in human history, the world had declared that there were crimes so monstrous that obedience could not excuse them, that I was following orders was not a defense but a confession. As the Reich collapsed, so too did the illusion that civilization was immune to barbarism. The Einsatzgruppen, the camps, the lists, the trains, all had been built by educated men, organized by clerks, staffed by ordinary citizens. The lesson was terrible in its simplicity. Evil did not require monsters. It required functionaries, willing hands, and silence. When the war ended, Europe stood amid its own ruins, forced to ask how it had allowed such darkness to flourish. There were no easy answers, only the slow work of remembrance. And as survivors began to speak, in courtrooms, in books, in whispers to their children, the world began to understand that what had been destroyed could not be rebuilt, but what had been forgotten could still be remembered. The Reich had fallen, but its shadows remained lingering in the ashes, in the nightmares of survivors, in the quiet denial of those who in ability had looked away. The war was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The reckoning, the silence that followed the guns, was not peace. It was the sound of a world trying to understand what it had just done to itself. Across Europe, the air still smelled of smoke and rot, the earth still soft with unburied bones. The war had ended, but its ghosts were everywhere in the empty houses, the nameless graves, the hollow eyes of survivors who had seen the machinery of death up close. Germany lay in ruins, divided and humiliated, its cities shattered, its people starving, its leaders either dead or awaiting trial. And yet, for those who had carried out the slaughter, the reckoning was only beginning. The Allied tribunals convened in Nuremberg under gray skies and the weight of history. The Palace of Justice stood among the wreckage, one of the few intact buildings in a city flattened by bombs. Inside, the defendants sat in glass boxes, men who had once commanded armies and death squads, who had given orders that exterminated millions, now reduced to frightened silhouettes behind cold transparency. Their uniforms were gone, their medals confiscated, their arrogance stripped away. What remained was the unbearable ordinariness of their faces. Clerks, lawyers, administrators, bureaucrats. They looked like anyone and everyone, and that was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. The trial of the Einsatzgruppen began in September 1947. 24 officers were charged with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in criminal organizations. They were the architects and executioners of the final solution. Before the gas chambers, the men who had stood at the edge of pits and commanded others to fire, who had written reports tallying deaths with bureaucratic precision, who had turned genocide into an administrative routine. Among them sat Otto Ohlendorf, calm, immaculate, his voice steady as he testified about his role in commanding Einsatzgruppe D. He spoke of killing tens of thousands, of the necessity of his actions, of his duty. His words were chillingly devoid of emotion, not confessional, not defiant, merely factual. "I was obeying orders," he said, as though the sentence itself were a shield. The prosecutors did not shout. They did not need to. They presented the documents, the daily reports, the orders signed in careful script, the photographs, the survivor testimonies. Each sheet of paper was a death warrant. Each name on those pages had once been a life, a face, a child with a future. The evidence piled up like the bodies once had. There was no denying it. Not anymore. Ohlendorf was asked whether he believed his actions were just. He hesitated, then answered with chilling composure, "Yes, according to my understanding of the law at that time." That sentence hung in the courtroom like smoke. The men who followed Hitler had not believed themselves to be murderers. They had believed themselves to be lawful executioners of an ideology. That was the heart of the horror. That legality and morality had been separated. That obedience had replaced conscience. Witnesses took the stand, their voices trembling but unbroken. Survivors described what they had seen, the convoys arriving in the dawn mist, the commands shouted in clipped German, the crack of rifles, the screams that faded into silence. Some had hidden beneath corpses, others had escaped through forests, others had survived by accident, chosen for labor instead of execution. Their stories were fragments of a shattered mirror, each reflecting a piece of the truth that the world had tried to turn away from. One woman, from Ukraine, described how she had been forced to dig graves before being lined up at their edge. She had been shot, but the bullet had grazed her head. She woke under the bodies of her family. When she spoke, her voice did not rise or falter. "I dug my mother's grave," she said. "Then they told me to lie next to her." The courtroom fell silent. Even the defendants, for once, looked away. The trials dragged on for months. The defense argued predictably that their clients had acted under orders, that refusal meant death, that they had no choice. But the prosecutors presented proof that this was a lie. No member of the Einsatzgruppen had ever been executed for refusing to kill. Refusal might have meant reassignment, perhaps a reprimand, but never death. The truth was simpler, darker. Most had not refused because they had not wanted to. They had believed, they had obeyed. They had enjoyed the power that came from deciding who lived and who died. When the verdicts were read, the words echoed through the courtroom like distant thunder. 14 sentenced to death by hanging, 2 to life imprisonment, others to terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. A few would never serve those sentences. The Cold War would soon shift priorities, and many would be released early, their crimes buried under political convenience. But in that moment, there was a sense, however fragile, that justice had spoken. Otto Ohlendorf was executed in June 1951. Witnesses said he walked to the gallows with the same calm he had displayed in court. No remorse, no reflection, just a man fulfilling another order. His final words were brief and bureaucratic. "I die believing in my Germany." The trapdoor opened and silence followed. Beyond the trials, a different kind of reckoning was unfolding, one inside the conscience of a continent. Germany was forced to confront itself. Schools reopened with new curricula stripped of Nazi ideology, yet the memories remained raw, the guilt unspoken. Many Germans claimed ignorance, insisting they hadn't known what the SS had done in their name. But ignorance had always been the easiest refuge. The ashes that had fallen from crematorium chimneys had covered every roof. The smell of burning flesh had been impossible to ignore. Denial became the nation's new survival instinct. For survivors, justice felt hollow. The trials had executed a handful of men, but millions were dead. How could punishment ever match that scale? Many survivors testified not for revenge, but for remembrance. so that the world could never again pretend it did not know. They wanted the truth written down, recorded, acknowledged. For them, memory was justice. Historians, in the years that followed, would piece together the machinery of extermination in painstaking detail. They studied the reports of the Einsatzgruppen, the Einsatzkommandos, the logistics of murder written in the language of efficiency. Each word, each number, each signature revealed how ordinary men could commit extraordinary evil when given authority and purpose. Some perpetrators, untried and unrepentant, built new lives in the chaos of post-war Europe. They became businessmen, politicians, even police officers in the new West Germany. Others fled to South America, to the Middle East, to wherever the shadows were long enough to hide them. Decades later, Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal would track them down, one by one, uncovering old lies and exposing names thought forgotten. The chase would last lifetimes. Some would die in prison, others peacefully in their beds. The world's memory was long, but not eternal. Yet even as justice faltered, remembrance endured. In the ruins of Kiev, at Babi Yar, Soviet workers raised a monument over the ravine where 33,000 people had been slaughtered. It was simple, stark, and silent, a wound carved into the landscape. In Poland, at sites like Sobibor and Treblinka, survivors returned to the forests where their families had vanished. They built memorials, not of triumph, but of warning. And, across Europe, people began to speak the words that had been unspoken, that civilization itself had turned against humanity, that the veneer of progress was thinner than anyone had dared to believe. The Holocaust was not only a teeter crime, it was a revelation, a mirror held up to mankind's darkest potential. The Einsatzgruppen had shown that the line between order and atrocity could vanish the moment obedience replaced morality. Their victims had been murdered not in secret but in plain sight, before the eyes of villages and soldiers who chose not to see. The silence of the bystanders became as deadly as the bullets of the perpetrators. As the decades passed, the survivors aged. Their testimonies became the most powerful legacy left behind words, carrying the weight of all who could not speak. In classrooms and museums, their stories became warnings etched into collective memory. Never again, people said. Yet history, always patient, waited to see if humanity would mean it. In the end, the reckoning was never complete. How could it be? No tribunal could measure the worth of a murdered child. No gallows could balance the scales of 6 million dead. What Nuremberg and its successors achieved was not closure but clarity. The acknowledgement that justice, however imperfect, was possible, and that silence was complicity. The world had stared into its own abyss and, for a moment, recoiled. The ruins of the Reich became classrooms. The graves became warnings. The testimonies became scripture. And from them, the question that would haunt generations arose not how such evil had been done, but how ordinary people had allowed it. The reckoning was not a single moment in history. It was the beginning of an endless duty to remember, to question, to resist the comforting lie that it could never happen again. The shadows of memory. The war had ended, but for millions, the silence that followed was louder than the guns. Across Europe, ghosts walked in daylight, not the imagined phantoms of folklore, but the living remnants of what the world had tried to annihilate. The survivors emerged from forests, from camps, from hiding places where they had clung to life like moss on stone. They were thin, hollow-eyed, wrapped in rags and disbelief. Behind them lay the graves of entire nations. Ahead of them, uncertainty, hunger, and a question no one could answer. Where do we go now? In the ruins of cities, the first sounds of peace were not songs but footsteps, hesitant, unfamiliar, as though the earth itself was learning how to breathe again. Survivors walked through streets lined with rubble and ash, searching for names, faces, and homes that no longer existed. Some found walls scrawled with messages, "If you return, I am alive." Most found nothing. For those who had escaped the Einsatzgruppen's bullets and the camp chimneys, survival was not victory, it was a sentence of memory. They had seen too much to ever live as before. The Allies spoke of rebuilding. They drafted plans, divided zones, and spoke of new beginnings. But beneath the politics and reconstruction, the horror of what had been discovered in the East still pulsed like an open wound. The liberation of the camps had shown the world only the surface, the skeletal figures, the mountains of shoes, the ash-filled fields. The deeper crimes, the shootings in ravines and forests, were harder to grasp. The Einsatzgruppen had left behind no fences or ovens, only the soil itself as witness. For the Soviets, these atrocities were proof of fascist barbarity, to be recorded and used for propaganda. For the Western Allies, they were evidence for tribunals, legal cases, precedents in international law. But for the survivors, the few who had crawled out of pits or hidden beneath the bodies of the dead, they were memories etched into the marrow, inescapable and unwanted. Many tried to speak, but found that no one wished to listen. In post-war Germany, the word Einsatzgruppen was rarely spoken. The country's focus turned to hunger, reconstruction, and survival. Denazification committees were formed, but quickly became exercises in paperwork and convenience. Former party members filled out forms, signed declarations of ignorance, and returned to their jobs. The same policemen who had once helped coordinate deportations now wore new uniforms in the Federal Republic's fledgling law enforcement. The bureaucrats who had signed transport orders became clerks again, their pasts sanitized by necessity. Germany needed administrators, teachers, engineers. The past was a burden, and burdens were set aside when rebuilding. The survivors noticed. They wrote memoirs. In small editions few read. They gave testimony to tribunals, to journalists, to historians who were themselves struggling to understand. Many were met with disbelief or indifference. The world wanted to move forward, not backward. To remember the war was to reopen wounds. To remember the killings in the East was to confront complicity. The Holocaust, that word still unformed in the late 1942, had no vocabulary yet. The events were too vast for language. In Eastern Europe, where the ravines still hid the bones of millions, memory was shaped by ideology. Soviet authorities recorded the massacres but erased the identity of the victims. Jews were rebranded as Soviet citizens, and anti-Semitic realities were replaced with narratives of national suffering. The politics of remembrance became as cold as the mass graves themselves. In places like Babi Yar, monuments rose without mention of who had died there. The earth remembered, even if the marble lied. In the West, the new Jewish state in Palestine became a beacon for those with nowhere left to go. Displaced persons camps filled with survivors who had lost everything except the will to begin again. They married, bore children, built small communities on ashes. For many, Israel represented more than refuge. It was defiance, the living rebuttal to extermination. But even there, silence lingered. In the new nation's early years, survivors were often seen not as heroes, but as reminders of humiliation people who had endured instead have fought. It would take decades for their voices to be fully heard. Meanwhile, in Germany, an entire generation grew up under the shadow of denial. Parents did not speak of what they had seen or done. Teachers skipped the years between 1933 and 1945. Children asked questions and received evasions. "We didn't know," adults said. "We had no choice." The silence became part of the national fabric, a collective amnesia masquerading as innocence. But silence is never empty. It hums beneath the surface, waiting to be broken. That rupture came slowly. In the 1960 seconds, the children of the war generation began to ask what their fathers had done during the Reich. In courtrooms across West Germany, new trials reopened old wounds. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 revealed testimonies that forced a nation to confront itself. And among those rediscovered files, The records of the Einsatzgruppen resurfaced the reports, the orders, the tallies of death, written in tidy German script. The killers had documented everything. It was their downfall and history's evidence. Young Germans took to the streets, demanding truth and accountability. Some disowned their families. Others joined movements determined to expose the buried crimes. Universities became battlegrounds of remembrance. The words "we didn't know" no longer sufficed. The generation born in rubble demanded to know what their parents had done in the forests of Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. The shame of silence became heavier than the shame of guilt. In the same years, the pursuit of justice took on new forms. Nazi hunters tracked fugitives across continents. In Argentina, Adolf Eichmann, the man who had organized the logistics of genocide, was captured by Mossad agents in 1960. His trial in Jerusalem brought the bureaucracy of death into the public eye. Survivors testified, not as abstractions, but as human evidence. The world watched, perhaps truly listening for the first time. And though Eichmann had not commanded the Einsatzgruppen, his defense was the same as theirs. "I was following orders." The phrase became infamous, a chilling shorthand for moral surrender. Philosophers, psychologists, and theologians dissected it, searching for meaning in obedience. How could men, educated, cultured, civilized men with families and aspirations, participate in mass murder? The question would haunt post-war thought for generations. It was easier to demonize monsters than to admit that the monsters were human. In time, Germany began to remember not just in shame but in structure. Memorials rose in Berlin, Munich, and countless small towns. Streets were renamed, textbooks rewritten. The phrase Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, entered the national lexicon. Yet even as the state tried to codify remembrance, many ordinary Germans continued to turn away, overwhelmed by the scale of what their nation had done. Memory became a civic duty, but guilt remained a private wound. Elsewhere, in Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Soviet Union would finally allow archives to open. Historians uncovered NKVD files, Einsatzgruppen reports, and Soviet documentation of massacres long hidden behind ideological censorship. The true numbers of victims began to emerge, the names restored from anonymity. In the 1,990 seconds, scholars and survivors' families visited sites, forgotten for half a century, fields, now overgrown, villages rebuilt over graves. They placed stones, recited prayers, whispered names into winds that had forgotten their echoes. And yet, the ghosts never truly left. Each discovery brought new questions. How could ordinary people have stood by? How could priests bless bullets, teachers mark attendance lists, farmers dig graves? The answers were never simple. Fear, conformity, ideology, hatred, all intertwined in a web that had snared millions. The Einsatzgruppen had not merely killed, they had revealed what society becomes when morality yields to obedience. By the dawn of the 21st century, the witnesses were fading. The men and women who had seen the ravines filled with bodies were old, their memories fragile but insistent. Museums and memorial foundations recorded their testimonies before time could erase them. Documentaries, books, and classrooms carried their voices into a new century, a warning for a world that seemed to forget too easily. In the ruins of Kiev, the Babi Yar ravine remained, grass growing over the soil that still held bone and ash. In Lithuania, the forests of Ponary whispered with the wind. In Belarus, villages rebuilt over pits, occasionally unearthed remains when the ground thawed in spring. Each site was a reminder that history's dust is never settled, it only waits. The shadows of memory stretched across generations. Children of survivors carried invisible scars, the inherited trauma of silence and fear. Children of perpetrators wrestled with shame they did not earn, but could not escape. Together, they became the keepers of a truth too vast for one lifetime. Remembering, they learned, was not enough. Understanding was harder. It meant acknowledging that the Einsatzgruppen were not anomalies but warnings. proof of how civilization collapses not in chaos, but in order, not in rage, but in obedience. As the last survivors passed away, their stories became the world's conscience. And somewhere, in a quiet archive under the hum of fluorescent light, the original reports of the death squads remain, pages yellowed with time, ink still legible, the handwriting neat and professional. Executed, 3,287 Jews, 142 communists, 19 partisans. The clerks who wrote those lines believed they were writing history, and they were. The question is, what kind of history will we write in return? The hunt for shadows. In the dim corridors of post-war Europe, a new kind of battle began, not with rifles or tanks, but with files, photographs, whispers, and ghosts. The war had ended in 1945, but for those who had survived the Einsatzgruppen's reach, the real war, the one for memory, for justice, for meaning, was only beginning. The perpetrators had vanished into the chaos of surrender, their uniforms buried, their insignias torn away, their pasts rewritten in the confusion of defeat. Yet the graves they left behind were shallow, and the earth was restless. When Allied forces first began to collect evidence of Nazi crimes, they found documents so meticulous that disbelief competed with horror. Every bullet fired, every transport arranged, every action completed had been logged in reports, written with bureaucratic precision. The Erignismeldungen operational situation reports listed thousands upon thousands of killings as though they were production statistics. Executed 1,247 Jews, 56 communists, 12 gypsies. These were the ledgers of annihilation. And the men who had written them were still out there, some living under assumed names, others hiding in plain sight among the ruins of the Reich. At Nuremberg, the first attempts at justice took shape. The world gathered to pass judgment on the architects of war and genocide. The Einsatzgruppen trial, one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, opened in 1947. 24 men sat in the dock, including commanders who had directed entire regions of slaughter. Ohlendorf, Blobel, Naumann, and Sandberger among them. The evidence was overwhelming. Their own signatures on reports, their own words testifying to liquidations, special actions, cleansings. Otto Ohlendorf, commander of Einsatzgruppe D, confessed calmly, describing the murder of more than 90,000 people as though reciting logistics. He was articulate, unflinching, even proud of his efficiency. When asked how children were killed, he explained that mothers held them in their arms to spare them the fear of being shot alone. The court fell silent. For the first time, the world heard genocide spoken of not in screams, but in sentences. The trial's verdicts were historic: 14 death sentences, 2 life imprisonments, 5 long-term sentences. But history's justice proved less permanent than its memory. Within a few years, most of those condemned to life were released. Even several death sentences were commuted. By the 1952, the new political reality of the Cold War demanded reconciliation with West Germany, not endless reckoning. Washington and London now saw Moscow as the greater enemy. The hunt for Nazis quietly lost priority. While governments forgot, others remembered. A small network of survivors, Jewish organizations, and Allied veterans began their own pursuit, unfinanced, unofficial, relentless. Among them was Simon Wiesenthal, a man whose life had been shattered in the camps, and who now dedicated it to tracking those who had escaped the hangman's noose. Working from a tiny office in Linz, Austria, with a typewriter, old newspapers, and a ferocious memory, Wiesenthal turned fragments into leads, and leads into names. His letters to governments were often ignored, but his persistence was legendary. "Justice," he said, "is not a bullet. It is a long memory." Some fugitives, like Adolf Eichmann, had fled across oceans. Others simply walked away. The chaos of post-war Europe was fertile ground for disappearance. Displaced persons camps were overflowing, documentation chaotic, and millions of Germans on the move. A man could vanish simply by walking east or west, by changing a name, by claiming to be a refugee from another region. The Vatican's rat lines, covert escape routes originally meant for anti-communist refugees, became arteries of escape for SS men. Through Italy and Spain, they moved toward new lives in Argentina, Chile, and the Middle East. In Buenos Aires, Eichmann lived as Ricardo Clement, working at a Mercedes-Benz factory, raising a family, and believing himself forgotten. But Israel had not forgotten. In 1960, Mossad agents tracked him down, abducted him, and flew him to Jerusalem. His trial was the first in history to broadcast genocide to living rooms around the world. Survivors took the stand one by one, giving names, places, dates, transforming statistics into human voices. The world finally saw what the Einsatzgruppen's efficiency had buried. Eichmann's execution in 1962 sent a message, but it was only a fraction of the reckoning still owed. The majority of Einsatzgruppen officers escaped prosecution altogether. Some resumed respectable lives in West Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, working as teachers, businessmen, lawyers, even civil servants. Decades later, when historians unearthed their wartime records, neighbors reacted with disbelief. Herr Müller? Impossible. He was always so polite. Evil had put on the face of normalcy and gone shopping. The 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds brought a new wave of investigations. German prosecutors, pressured by international outrage and by a generation unwilling to inherit silence, reopened cases long buried in archives. Trials in Ulm, Munich, and Hamburg exposed once again the machinery of the death squads. Witnesses, now elderly, pointed across courtrooms at men who had once commanded their fates. Defendants claimed fading memories, orders from above, coercion. The refrain of obedience echoed again and again, hollow, rehearsed, unchanged. But justice, by now, had a weary rhythm. The legal system moved slowly, witnesses died, evidence decayed. For every trial concluded, dozens of perpetrators remained unidentified or untouched. Many had died peacefully in their beds, surrounded by families who never knew or pretended not to know. The enormity of the crime was too vast for the mechanisms of law. The Einsatzgruppen had killed more than 1 million people in 2 years, more than any court could ever prosecute. Outside the courtrooms, another kind of pursuit unfolded. One fought with pens, not pistols. Historians, journalists, and filmmakers began to unearth the forgotten stories of the mobile killing squads. Raoul Hilberg's monumental The Destruction of the European Jews, 1961, exposed the bureaucratic anatomy of genocide, showing how offices, memos, and logistics could become instruments of mass murder. Later, Claude Lanzmann's Shoah gave voice to the silences, the ravines, the forests, the words left unsaid. The story of the Einsatzgruppen emerged not as a prelude to Auschwitz, but as the template for it. As the decades passed, the last living perpetrators became relics of a vanishing generation. In the 1,980 seconds and 90 seconds, efforts to bring them to justice were renewed. Nazi hunters like Serge and Beate Klarsfeld pursued them across Europe, armed with dossiers and moral fury. In the US, the Office of Special Investigations exposed former Nazis who had emigrated under false pretenses, stripping them of citizenship. Some were deported, a few tried, many died before judgment. Time itself had become both enemy and accomplice. In Germany, the debate turned inward. How long must guilt endure? Should the children bear the weight of their father's sins? The questions divided families and governments alike. Museums and memorials were built, but every commemoration reopened old wounds. Some wanted closure. Others insisted there could be none. Memory, after all, is not a wound that heals. It is a scar that speaks. By the early 21st century, the pursuit of justice had become an act of defiance against forgetting. In small courtrooms, in cases against men, now in their 90 seconds, prosecutors still read the same reports. Einsatzgruppe, 27 July 1941, 2,345 executed. The accused, frail and stooped, sometimes claimed not to remember, sometimes refused to speak. But the documents remembered. The archives never forgot. The digital age brought new forms of remembrance. Online databases cataloged victims' names. Photographs long thought lost resurfaced in 2-1 museum archives. Families traced their murdered ancestors across continents through scans of yellowed lists. Memory, once silenced, found new life in data. The ravines and forests became coordinates on interactive maps, each dot a life restored to history. The ghosts, at last, had names again. Yet even as the record grew clearer, the lessons blurred. In the modern world's noise of new wars, new hatreds, new lies, the old patterns sometimes reappeared in disturbing echoes. Genocide scholars warned that the same mechanics of dehumanization, propaganda, and obedience still lurked beneath civilization's surface. Never again, once a vow, sounded increasingly like a question. In the final reckoning, perhaps the pursuit of the Einsatzgruppen was never truly about punishment. It was about memory, about proving that history could not be erased by the passing of years or the death of witnesses. Justice was incomplete, but remembrance endured, and in that endurance lay defiance. Somewhere in an archive in Ludwigsburg, Germany, in a quiet room lined with files, lies a single folder stamped Einsatzgruppe B. Inside are pages typed in 1941, lists of villages, figures of the dead, and signatures of men long gone. On the last page, in neat script, a final line reads, "The area is now free of Jews." That sentence, simple, bureaucratic, final, contains the silence of a million graves. But history has rewritten it. The area is not free of memory. The names return in whispers, in prayers, in lessons taught to children who will never see those forests, but will carry their stories forward. Justice fades, but memory does not. And somewhere, beneath the quiet soil of Eastern Europe, the earth still breathes the truth. The architects of silence. The world rebuilt itself on ruins. Cities scarred by bombing began to hum again, with the sounds of commerce and laughter. Children were born who would never see the black uniforms, never smell the smoke, yet beneath the sounds, the surface of recovery, an older machinery still turned, powered by secrecy, compromise, and fear. The war had ended, but the war's architects had not all vanished. Many had simply traded their old allegiances for new masters. The silence that followed was not forgetfulness, it was a kind of design. In the first post-war years, Europe became a continent of shadows. Intelligence agencies, newly born or hastily reorganized, scavenged for expertise wherever they could find it. The Cold War had descended quickly, and ideological lines were redrawn overnight. Yesterday's enemy could become today's ally if he knew the right secrets, the right science, the right routes through the wreckage of a divided world. And so, in offices from Washington to Bonn to Buenos Aires, men who had orchestrated or facilitated genocide found themselves useful once more. The American intelligence apparatus, desperate for information about the Soviet Union, initiated what became known as Operation Paperclip. Officially, it was a program to bring German scientists to the United States to advance aerospace and military research. Unofficially, it became a pathway for men whose hands were soaked in blood to enter the heart of the Western defense establishment. They arrived with sanitized resumes and new names, their wartime affiliations erased by bureaucratic sleight of hand. Not all had been SS, but enough were that moral questions began to rot in the basement of practicality. "We cannot afford moral scruples," one official wrote. "We are in a race for survival." In West Germany, the project of reintegration took on its own character. The new state, fragile and anxious, needed experienced administrators. Entire ministries were staffed with men who had served in the Nazi bureaucracy. Some had drawn up deportation schedules, Others had signed property confiscation orders. Now they drafted tax codes and trade regulations. Continuity was disguised as stability. When journalists or survivors raised objections, they were met with a weary refrain: "We must look forward, not back." It was not denial, exactly, but a form of self-preservation that masqueraded as pragmatism. Church networks, too, played their part, sometimes knowingly, sometimes blindly. Within monasteries and charitable organizations in Italy and Austria, priests and monks helped fugitives find new identities. They issued baptismal certificates, arranged travel papers, and coordinated routes to South America. The men they helped often claimed to be refugees fleeing Bolshevism. Few asked too many questions. The moral ambiguity was wrapped in piety. Helping the displaced was Christian duty. Yet among those displaced were the orchestrators of extermination. In Rome, Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian cleric with deep Nazi sympathies, became one of the most significant facilitators of these escapes. His seminary served as a transit hub, his letters of introduction as passports to new lives. When asked later why he had aided war criminals, Hudal's answer was chilling in its simplicity: "I wanted to save European civilization from communism." To him, the sins of the past were outweighed by the perceived threat of the future. In the logic of the Cold War, morality had become negotiable. Argentina, under Juan Perón, welcomed the fugitives with open arms. Buenos Aires, in the late 1940s and 50s, became a strange mirror of the vanished Reich, a place where ex-SS officers gathered in cafes, where German was spoken more than Spanish, where newsletters circulated about the old days. Some lived modestly, others thrived in business or politics. They called themselves exiles, not fugitives. To the survivors who tracked them, it felt like the world had turned itself inside out. In Eastern Europe, meanwhile, silence wore a different mask. The Soviet Union, eager to claim moral authority as the liberator of Europe, prosecuted some German officers with public fury. But their all-right trials often blurred the line between justice and propaganda. Many who had genuinely organized killings were lumped together with ordinary soldiers, their confessions extracted under torture, their executions rushed. The truth of the Einsatzgruppen's crimes was swallowed by the grand narrative of Soviet victory. Even the Jewish identity of victims was often erased, replaced with the term Soviet citizens. This was not remembrance, it was a repurposing of tragedy. As decades passed, the silence hardened into habit. Families of perpetrators maintained polite myths. He was just a clerk. He was forced. He never talked about the war. Children grew up in households where the past was an unspoken room, locked and dust-covered. In schools, textbooks skimmed over the years between 1939 and 1945 with a kind of embarrassed haste. Never again became a slogan, not a reckoning. And yet, in attics across Europe, boxes of documents still waited: letters, orders, photographs, diaries. The evidence was never fully buried. It only slept. The quiet complicity extended even to nations untouched directly by the killing fields. Switzerland's banks held accounts opened by men who would later vanish. Sweden's industries had traded with the Reich until its dying days. The Vatican negotiated concordats with regimes it despised but could not ignore. Everywhere, moral compromise had been woven into survival. And in that compromise, the story of the Einsatzgruppen, their creation, their obedience, their logic, found a strange afterlife. The world they had served was gone, but the systems that enabled them, the paperwork, the euphemisms, the deference to authority, persisted. In 1963, when the trial of Adolf Eichmann's deputy, Hermann Krümme, began in Frankfurt, something shifted. Witnesses stood in court and described the shootings, the trains, the emptying of villages. German journalists, now from a younger generation, filled the galleries. For the first time, West Germany was forced to look directly at its reflection. Television brought the testimony into living rooms. Housewives ironing shirts listened to survivors describe the pits at Babi Yar. Students saw their professors' names appear in documents. The silence cracked. It did not break easily. For every voice that demanded truth, another warned against reopening wounds. "You were not there," the older generation said. "You cannot understand." And perhaps that was true, but understanding was not the point. A society cannot heal what it refuses to see. The post-war world had built its stability on selective amnesia. Now, with each trial, each revelation, the scaffolding trembled. By the 1980 seconds, the pursuit of truth had become a moral necessity that transcended generations. New historians, younger, unburdened by wartime guilt, began to excavate archives with a forensic precision that rivaled the killer's own. They traced names, reconstructed chains of command, followed trails from battlefield to suburb. Their work revealed how thoroughly the Einsatzgruppen had been integrated into the ordinary machinery of state, how the same men who once filled forms in Berlin ended their careers, teaching law or engineering in respectable universities. But it was not only scholars who confronted the past. Artists, poets, and filmmakers took up the task of remembrance. Films like Shoah and Come and See stripped away distance, plunging viewers into the immediacy of atrocity. These works did not seek closure, they sought to make forgetting impossible. Memory, once suppressed, became culture's most radical act of defiance. The architects of silence had not anticipated this. They had believed that time would erode memory, that documentation could be destroyed, that the dead would remain voiceless. They underestimated the stubborn persistence of history. Files once sealed were opened. Governments issued apologies. Schools taught what had been omitted. Yet even in acknowledgement, the temptation to soften the truth persisted, to speak of tragedy rather than murder, mistakes rather than choices. As the century turned, the last of the perpetrators died, their names reduced to case numbers and gravestones. But their legacy lingered in the bureaucratic vocabulary they left behind, in the sterile phrases of modern cruelty, in the tendency to replace empathy with procedure. The Einsatzgruppen had shown that evil did not always wear a mask of madness. It often wore a suit, filled out a form, followed an order. The silence they built was not destroyed all at once. It was dismantled, word by word, document by document, generation by generation. And as the pieces fell away, what emerged was not redemption but recognition. The understanding that memory is fragile, that justice is never whole, that the distance between ordinary life and atrocity is alarmingly thin. Somewhere, in a quiet German village, an old man sat by a window, his grandchildren playing in the yard. They would never know that once, in another century, he had stood at the edge of a pit with a pistol in his hand. He would never tell them. The photographs were gone, the uniform burned, yet the silence between his heartbeats carried the weight of 1,000 voices that would not die. The architects of silence had hoped to bury the past. Instead, they built its monument. The world stands on it still. The weight of memory and the ghosts that speak. The war ended, but the voices did not. They lingered in the wind that swept across the fields of Belarus and Ukraine, in the forests of Lithuania, where the soil still refused to settle, in the cracked walls of abandoned ghettos. The bodies had been buried, the documents burned, but memory has a way of surviving not as history at first, but as unease, as the trembling silence that follows a scream too long held in. Europe, rebuilt with cement and slogans, tried to forget. But the ghosts were patient. They waited. In the years immediately following 1945, memory was a liability. Nations craved heroism, not guilt. Survivors who returned to their homes found strangers living in their houses, neighbors who averted their eyes, governments that wanted martyrs, not witnesses. The Soviet Union wrapped the Holocaust in the banner of Soviet suffering, erasing Jewish identity to serve a political narrative. In the West, there were trials. Yes, Nuremberg, Einsatzgruppen, Case 9. But these were seen as punctuation marks, not beginnings. Justice had been performed, the world told itself, and therefore, justice had been achieved. Yet in back rooms and basements, survivors began to write. On scraps of paper, in smuggled notebooks, in letters no one would ever read. They wrote not for history but for survival. To write was to remember, and to remember was to exist. It would take decades for their words to find ears willing to listen. In the 1,950 seconds, the world turned its gaze toward new conflicts. Korea, the Cold War, the Atomic Age. The Holocaust was an inconvenient memory in an era of rebuilding and modernity. The Germans themselves called it Die Vergangenheit. Die nicht vergehen will the past that will not pass. It hovered like smoke. And yet, inside that smoke, individual voices began to crystallize into testimony. A Polish tailor recounting the day his family was shot in a ravine. A Belarusian farmer describing how German officers ordered him to dig trenches for construction only to fill them with bodies. A former member of the Einsatzgruppen, broken by age and vodka, confessing to a priest who could no longer sleep. Memory, it turned out, had its own momentum. It could not be legislated away. By the 1,960 seconds, the children of those who had survived and those who had killed began asking questions. Why did their fathers flinch when the word East was spoken? Why did their mothers burn old letters? Why did the ground near certain villages remain barren decades after the war? The silence that had once been protective began to fracture. When the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials opened in 1963, a generation that had grown up in the shadow of ruins finally saw what had been hidden. Ordinary men describing extraordinary crimes, their justifications collapsing under the weight of their own monotone explanations. The banality of evil was no longer an abstract concept. It had a face, a voice, a bureaucratic precision that left the courtroom gasping. For survivors, the trials were both vindication and agony. To testify was to relive, to reopen wounds that had never closed. But without testimony, there could be no history, only rumor. Some, like Primo Levi, transformed memory into literature, turning trauma into moral inquiry. Others, like Simon Wiesenthal, made it into vocation, dedicating their lives to hunting those who had escaped justice. Their work was slow, patient, and often thankless. The world wanted to move on. They refused. They understood something vital. Forgetting was the final stage of genocide. To erase memory was to kill again. The Holocaust's memory became a battleground. Nations competed for narratives, victims and liberators, heroes and martyrs, each shaping history to fit political need. In the East, communist regimes used the memory of Nazi atrocities to legitimize their own power, conflating liberation with righteousness. In the West, silence was often defended as pragmatism. We must rebuild, leaders said, not dwell. But for survivors, dwelling was the only thing left. Their memories were not abstractions. They were physical landscapes, the smell of burning hair, the echo of shots at dawn, the taste of ash carried by the wind. In Israel, the newly founded state absorbed survivors into its mythology of resilience. Yet even there, the memory of the Holocaust was uncomfortable at first. The early Israeli ethos celebrated the fighter, not the victim. Survivors were viewed with pity, sometimes even shame. Why had they not resisted? Why had they not fought back? It would take the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 to shift that perception. When survivors took the stand and recounted their experiences, the world watched and Israel listened. The act of bearing witness became an act of defiance. The ghosts began to speak publicly. Eichmann, sitting in his glass booth, became the mirror through which humanity saw itself, the clerk who murdered millions by paperwork, the ordinary man who organized trains to hell with calm efficiency. The world expected a monster and found a bureaucrat. His trial forced a reckoning not only with the perpetrators, but with the systems that made them possible. It was no longer enough to say, "I followed orders." Eichmann had followed orders better than anyone, and that was precisely the horror. By the 1970 seconds, memory had turned into movement. Survivors wrote memoirs that defied literary convention. Films like Night and Fog, and later Shoah refused dramatization, relying instead on silence and duration, forcing viewers to sit within the discomfort of absence, the absence of names, of bodies, of moral clarity. The Holocaust was no longer simply history, it had become conscience. The Einsatzgruppen, once buried in appendices and footnotes, emerged as the terrifying prelude, the proof that genocide could be intimate, manual, and unmechanized. The gas chambers had been the perfection of efficiency. The Einsatzgruppen were its prototype in blood and soil. Historians began tracing the bureaucratic arteries of killing, discovering that many of the same officers who had organized mass shootings later oversaw deportations to extermination camps. The continuity was undeniable. The ideology had evolved, not disappeared. The ghosts had left signatures. In archives once sealed behind iron curtains, researchers uncovered detailed reports, operational situation reports, USSR, written by the Einsatzgruppen themselves, describing tens of thousands of deaths in the language of clerks and accountants. The operation was carried out without incident, one read. The terrain was suitable for burial. These documents were not only records of murder, they were monuments to the dehumanization of language itself. As survivors aged, their testimonies took on the urgency of final breaths. In classrooms and auditoriums, trembling hands held microphones and spoke to students who could not imagine the world they described. Teachers turned lessons into pilgrimages, traveling with pupils to places like Babi Yar, Ponary, and Minsk, places where the earth itself seemed to remember. The grass still refused to grow evenly. The air felt thick. Students returned, changed, silent. Memory had become not only inheritance, but initiation. And yet, for every lesson, there were deniers, men in suits and ties, who called themselves revisionists, who used the language of scholarship to disguise hatred. They called the Einsatzgruppen anti-partisan forces. They questioned numbers, photos, motives. They said history had been exaggerated for political gain. Their lies were not born of ignorance but of intent. To rewrite the past was to prepare the future for repetition. Survivors, frail and fading, stood again in public to refute them. Their words trembled, but their truth did not. By the end of the 20th century, the Holocaust had become the moral axis of modern history. Yet familiarity risked dulling its edge. Museums were built, memorials unveiled, textbooks standardized. The danger now was not denial, but indifference. When memory becomes routine, it loses its urgency. The Einsatzgruppen's crimes, stripped of immediacy, could begin to seem distant, academic, almost abstract, as if they belonged to another species, another era. But every archive, every testimony, every photo reminded us otherwise. It was not the monstrous who killed, it was the ordinary. Teachers, doctors, clerks, fathers, people who loved music, who wrote letters home, who kissed their children goodnight after shooting others' children by day. The ghosts that speak do not speak only from graves. They live in the patterns of obedience, in the silence that follows injustice, in the bureaucratic phrase that hides cruelty behind necessity. They speak every time a man justifies evil as efficiency, every time a woman looks away because the truth is too heavy to hold. Memory is not a monument, it is a mirror. And when we look into it, we do not see the past, we see the potential of the present. In the early 2000s, excavations across Eastern Europe uncovered new killing sites. At Bykivnia, at Bogdanovka, at Malý Trostenec, bones surfaced through shifting soil. Villagers came forward, their parents long dead, their stories half-whispered through generations. They remembered the sounds, the smoke, the silence afterward. The ghosts had waited long enough. Archaeologists catalogued remains with tenderness that felt like apology. Priests blessed the earth. Children placed flowers. The graves were no longer secret, but neither were they finished. They never would be. Technology gave memory new forms. Survivors' voices were digitized, their faces captured in 3D archives so that even after death they could speak to students decades hence. Artificial intelligence reconstructed lost testimonies, piecing together fragmented diaries. Memory had become immortal, but it also risked becoming mechanical, consumed, not felt. The challenge was no longer remembering, but meaningfully remembering. The question was not, did this happen? But what does it demand of us now? And so, in classrooms, museums, and quiet rooms lit by the glow of screens, the ghosts continued their work. They whispered in the gaps between historical certainty and moral complacency. They asked not for vengeance, not for pity, but for vigilance, because what? The Einsatzgruppen revealed what the Holocaust in its totality confirmed was not merely the depths of human cruelty, but the terrifying ease with which ordinary systems could become instruments of annihilation. The last survivors are dying now. Their hands, once raised in courtrooms and classrooms, tremble with age. Their memories are fragile, yet the weight they carry remains enormous. They pass it to us like a torch and a burden. We inherit not their suffering, but their responsibility. To remember, truly remember, is not to look backward with horror, but forward with resolve. The ghosts that speak do not want us to weep for them. They want us to see them and to recognize ourselves in the reflection. The Einsatzgruppen are gone. Their names are fading, but their echoes endure in every bureaucratic phrase that disguises cruelty, in every order obeyed without question, in every moment when silence feels safer than truth. The ghosts walk beside us, not to haunt, but to warn. Their message is simple, but it demands courage to hear. The line between civilization and barbarity is paper thin, and it is written by our choices. The earth remembers. The voices persist. The past is not past. It is alive, whispering through the cracks of our progress, asking the same question again and again. Will you listen this time? Ashes and archives. The silence beneath our feet. There are places in Eastern Europe where the ground breathes. If you stand quietly enough, you can feel it. The soft heaving of the earth where it should be still. In the meadows of Belarus, the forests of Lithuania, the ravines outside Kiev, the soil has memory. It remembers the weight of bodies, the heat of fire, the hurried shovels that tried to bury what could not be buried. It remembers the boots of men who came with lists and left with silence. When the snow melts each spring, the ground releases a faint scent of ash, of time refusing to decompose. That smell is history, raw and unvarnished. It seeps upward, demanding to be noticed. When the Red Army advanced west in 1944, their soldiers stumbled upon places that were not on any maps, pits, fields, clearings, where the air itself seemed corrupted. They called in investigators. The NKVD photographed, catalogued, exhumed. They documented the unthinkable with an efficiency that mirrored, in a grotesque symmetry, the bureaucracy of those who had caused it. In notebooks lined with neat Cyrillic script, Soviet officers recorded the number of corpses in each grave, the positions of bones, the bullet holes in skulls. The reports were factual, dispassionate, yet beneath the numbers lay an unspoken horror. These were not just Soviet citizens. They were Jews, Roma, prisoners, children. The Soviet reports did not always say so. Politics, even amid death, had its priorities, but the evidence was impossible to contain. The ground had become its own archive. When the war ended, that evidence was boxed and stored, buried again, this time in metal cabinets rather than dirt. The West began its own accounting. The Nuremberg trials opened in November 1945, a courtroom of ruins and rhetoric, where the language of law struggled to describe crimes that defied language itself. The Einsatzgruppen stood among the accused, their commanders no longer faceless but men with names and memories, their crisp uniforms replaced by prison garb. They listened as prosecutors read their own reports back to them, the operational situation reports they had written, boasting of efficiency, of order, of success measured in corpses. Now those same reports condemned them. Paper had turned into witness. The Einsatzgruppen trial of 1947-48, held separately from Nuremberg's main proceedings, was both revelation and reckoning. 24 defendants faced the charge of mass murder, not soldiers in battle, but administrators of extermination. Their defense was familiar: obedience, duty, the chain of command. I was only following orders. The phrase echoed through the courtroom like a curse. The judges, Americans who had seen the camps with their own eyes, understood that this excuse could not stand. Yet, even as they handed down sentences, 14 death penalties, 2 life imprisonments, the rest, long terms, a grim truth lingered. The machinery of justice, though righteous, could never balance the scales of what had been done. 1 million murdered by the Einsatzgruppen, 24 on trial. Arithmetic failed before morality. For decades afterward, the files gathered dust. The Cold War's Iron Curtain descended, dividing not only Europe but memory itself. In the East, Soviet narratives transformed the genocide into a story of fascism versus socialism, suppressing the specifically Jewish suffering in favor of collective martyrdom. In the West, the Holocaust was acknowledged, but the mobile killing squads, the intimate, face-to-face massacres, were overshadowed by the industrialized horror of Auschwitz. It was easier to speak of gas chambers than of men shooting families in daylight. The factory was impersonal, almost abstract. The ravine was human, too close for comfort. But archives have their own gravity. They pull truth toward the surface, however long it takes. In the 1,960 seconds, as West Germany wrestled with its past, investigators reopened dormant cases. A new generation of prosecutors, often born during the war, demanded answers from their elders. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials reignited interest in the early phases of the genocide. Scholars began to ask, before the camps, how did the killing begin? The answer lay buried in boxes labeled Einsatzgruppen. Historians combed through the surviving reports, thousands of pages written in sterile bureaucratic German. Each page listed numbers: 2,312 executed, 4,781 liquidated. The area cleansed of Jews. There was no poetry, no passion, only the rhythm of record-keeping. And that was the horror. The killers had not seen themselves as monsters, but as administrators of order. Their paperwork mirrored the structure of civilization: headings, signatures, precise totals, but the content belonged to hell. Reading those reports was like watching evil pretend to be normal. The archives became mirrors, showing not what men did when they were mad, but what they could do while believing they were sane. In the East, the Soviet Union kept its own troves sealed. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, those archives finally opened, and the ghosts came flooding out. Boxes of photographs, interrogation transcripts, testimonies from witnesses and collaborators, entire histories hidden for half a century. Local historians, many working on shoestring budgets, began uncovering forgotten killing sites. In small towns across Ukraine and Belarus, villagers came forward with stories their parents had whispered but never dared record. There was shooting in the forest, they would say. They made us dig. Then they told us to go home. These memories were fragments, yet when assembled, they formed mosaics of unbearable clarity. In one village near Zhytomyr, researchers found a ravine that had never been marked. Beneath layers of soil lay thousands of spent cartridges, bone shards, and children's shoes. In another, near Smolensk, the remains of entire families were unearthed, their hands bound with wire, their skulls shattered at close range. The documents confirmed what the Earth already knew. These were the victims of mobile killing squads. The ghosts, once buried under the weight of ideology and indifference, began to speak through forensic science. Every bone was a sentence, every bullet a signature. By the early 2000s, a French Catholic priest named Patrick Desbois began his own mission. He traveled through Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, interviewing aging villagers, locating mass graves, documenting the undocumentable. His work, published as The Holocaust by H.A. Bullets, revealed that the killing fields of the East were far more extensive than anyone had dared imagine. He estimated over 2 million Jews were murdered by gunfire, often within walking distance of their homes. His approach was not forensic alone, it was spiritual. He treated each site as a grave, each witness as a mourner. "We are late," he said in interviews, his voice trembling. "But the earth is still speaking." The archives and the earth began to converge. Satellite imaging, drone photography, and digital mapping brought new precision to old horrors. Historians traced the routes of Einsatzgruppen units day by day, matching their reports to local topography. The result was a map of annihilation that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, a geography of genocide visible from the stars. Technology, once the tool of bureaucracy, had become the servant of memory. And yet, amid all this revelation, a haunting realization emerged. No map, no archive, no documentary could truly contain the absence left behind. For every name recovered, 1,000 remained lost. For every grave marked, another lay forgotten, beneath a farm or a road. The silence beneath our feet was infinite. Meanwhile, survivors' testimonies, those fragile human documents, began to fade with their tellers. Projects like Shoah Foundation raced against time to record their voices. Thousands of hours of footage captured trembling hands, quivering eyes, memories told through tears and halting breaths. Some spoke calmly, like witnesses giving weather reports from another planet. Others broke mid-sentence, their silence saying what words could not. When their bodies failed, their voices remained digital phantoms in a world that could now listen forever. Memory had become immortal, but it was not invulnerable. Technology could preserve the sound, but not the feeling. That responsibility still belonged to the living. The 21st century brought a strange paradox. The Holocaust was more documented than any atrocity in human history, yet disbelief and distortion were growing. Online forums twisted facts into conspiracies. Politicians invoked the Holocaust for petty comparisons. Extremist movements resurrected the very symbols that had marched across Europe 80 years earlier. The Einsatzgruppen, once the embodiment of evil, were being recast by revisionists as security forces in a complex war. The archives that had once condemned them were being weaponized by cynics who knew that overwhelming evidence could itself become noise. The more facts there are, the easier it is for liars to cherry-pick. Memory, it seemed, could be drowned in information. Yet even amid this new confusion, truth endured in the simplest of testimonies. A child's shoe found in a pit, a photograph of villagers standing beside a truck, a list written in pencil naming 50 names crossed out with red ink. These fragments are unimpeachable. They are too mundane to be forged, too precise to be dismissed. They are the heartbeat of history. And when you piece them together, the reports, the graves, the voices, the photographs, you get not only a record of genocide, but a portrait of humanity itself, its obedience, its cowardice, its astonishing capacity to look away. The legacy of the Einsatzgruppen is not only their cruelty, but their ordinariness. They were not demons, they were clerks, teachers, fathers, engineers. They sent letters home describing the countryside's beauty after executions. They played cards in the evenings, toasted promotions with schnapps. They believed they were building a better world. That belief, banal, bureaucratic, sincere, is the most terrifying thing the archives reveal. Evil does not announce itself with horns and fire. It comes with a briefcase, a pen, and a rationale. As we move further from those years, the danger shifts. Forgetting no longer means denial. It means dilution. The Holocaust becomes a lesson, then a Bix reference, then a metaphor. The Einsatzgruppen become a paragraph in a textbook, a word students mispronounce before the bell rings. The archives become museum pieces, inert, their horror absorbed into familiarity. But the ghosts are not finished. They speak in the tremor of our own age, in the refugee camps, in the rhetoric of dehumanization, in the apathy that greets suffering beyond our borders. Every time we say, "It's complicated," when faced with injustice, a whisper rises from the earth. So, it was then, at Babi Yar, the ravine outside Kyiv, where 33,000 were murdered in 2 days, the memorial now stands quiet. Trees grow thick where the ground once ran red. Visitors walk slowly, whispering, photographing, some unaware of what lies beneath. In winter, snow smooths the terrain, turning the site into a blank page. But beneath that page, the story persists. The bodies are gone, the archives are full, but the silence is alive. It hums with the memory of what men can do and what others can ignore. The archives are not just repositories of the past, they are warnings written in dust and paper. They tell us that civilization is fragile, that progress can coexist with barbarism, that bureaucracy can become a weapon more deadly than any gun. The Einsatzgruppen did not act in chaos, they acted in order. Their crimes were scheduled, reported, signed. That is why they matter still, because they remind us that evil wears the mask of normality. And so the earth continues to breathe. The documents continue to whisper. The past remains restless beneath our feet, refusing the comfort of closure. Every archive, every grave, every name carved into stone is a pulse in the heart of history, reminding us that remembering is not an act of mourning but of resistance. When you walk through those forests, listen. The wind sounds like paper turning. The leaves rustle like whispers, in German, Russian, Yiddish. The silence is not empty, it is full. It asks only that you stop, that you listen, that you remember. Because somewhere beneath you, the earth is still speaking, and it is asking the same question the archives have been asking since the first shovel fell into the first grave. Now that you know, what will you do? The lessons of darkness. The night has a sound if you listen closely enough. It isn't silence, not truly. It hums faintly, the low breath of a world that remembers. Wind moving through pine trees in the forests of Ukraine. The distant drip of water into a ravine near Minsk. Somewhere, far below that soil, bones lie mingled with roots, dust, and forgotten buttons. They are quieter than prayer, but they are not gone. The dead are never entirely silent, only patient. And in that patience, there is a lesson the living keep refusing to learn. History is a pulse, irregular, fragile, but always returning to the same rhythm. It beats under the boots of armies, under the speeches of tyrants, under the soft lullabies sung by mothers who never know whether morning will come. It beats beneath the paved streets of cities rebuilt over ruins, beneath our universities and museums, beneath the monuments we erect to say, "Never again." But every monument is also a confession. It says, "We have said this before. We will have to say it again." The story of the Einsatzgruppen is not confined to the past. It is a mirror held up to the human soul, and the reflection, even now, is uncomfortable. They were not monsters. That is what makes them terrifying. They were men who brushed their teeth, who sent letters home, who asked for transfers when the killing became too personal, then returned to finish their work because orders were orders. They found ways to rationalize each bullet as duty, each scream as noise. They used language to make murder sound like management. And when they signed their reports, they signed away something far greater than their humanity. They signed away the illusion that evil must look inhuman to exist. What happened in those years was not born from madness but from logic. A twisted, bureaucratic, perfect logic. The kind that begins with a phrase like security measures and ends with a ravine full of children. The kind that dresses itself in euphemisms that makes cruelty sound professional. The Einsatzgruppen did not shout. They documented, they measured, they filed reports. Their efficiency was not in their rifles but in their organization. They proved that when a society worships obedience more than conscience, paperwork can become a weapon deadlier than any bomb. And yet, this is not just a story about Germany or 1941 or the ravines of the East. It is about us, about what we allow ourselves to ignore. Every generation inherits the silence of those before it. We build museums and make documentaries, we teach the dates, but the warning dissolves into ritual. The Holocaust becomes a symbol, a lesson to quote, rather than confront. We say never again, but we whisper it like a bedtime story instead of a commandment. We forget that the men of the Einsatzgruppen were not born villains. They became them by increments. Small choices, each justified by fear, by ambition, by comfort. They did not wake up one morning and decide to exterminate millions. They just stopped questioning, and the world let them. Every genocide begins not with bullets, but with indifference, with laughter at the wrong joke, with silence in the face of lies, with neighbors learning to look away. That was the first lesson of the darkness, that evil does not always arrive with fanfare, but with fatigue. People simply get tired of caring. They tell themselves it is not their problem, that someone else will speak up, that the world is too complicated for simple morality. And by the time they realize that silence has its own weight, it is too late. The second lesson is harder. Civilization is fragile. We think progress is permanent because our buildings stand tall, because our phones connect continents, because our laws seem unshakable. But the Reich also had laws. It had scientists, artists, architects, philosophers. It had Beethoven and Goethe, libraries full of brilliance. And still, its people dug mass graves for children. Culture is not a vaccine against cruelty. It is a mirror that shows how refined cruelty can become. After the war, many of the men who had served in the Einsatzgruppen melted back into ordinary life. Some were tried and hanged. Many more simply disappeared into the bureaucracy of a recovering nation. They became clerks, businessmen, fathers again. They avoided questions, avoided mirrors. And when their grandchildren asked what they had done in the war, they said, "We didn't know," or "I had no choice." Lies become lighter with repetition. Some even believed them. Memory, after all, is not built of facts alone. It's built of what people can bear to remember. But memory is more resilient than guilt. It waits in archives, in film reels, in the yellowed pages of reports stamped Geheime Reichssache. It waits in the testimonies of survivors who spoke through trembling voices before the end. And it waits in the soil, in the physical geography of murder that cannot be erased by denial. Historians, archaeologists, and descendants have brought these voices back into light, one grave at a time. Each exhumed bone is a rebuke to amnesia. Each rediscovered name is a resurrection. There is something almost unbearable in the ordinariness of how the world continued after it was over. Markets reopened. Children went back to school. The same roads that led to killing fields led back to civilization. The ash of burned bodies mingled with farmland soil, nourishing the next year's crops. History moved on, but the ground never forgot. And here we are, nearly a century later, surrounded by the same potential, the same politics of fear, the same hunger for scapegoats, the same machinery of proper sentential, language that sanitizes cruelty. The lesson of darkness was never about the past alone. It was about the conditions that make the past repeatable. Every time we trade truth for convenience, every time we accept the suffering of others as necessary, we rebuild the same foundations that made the Einsatzgruppen possible. Evil does not need uniforms. It needs apathy. The light of remembrance is not meant to comfort. It is meant to blind us, to force us to see what human beings are capable of when morality becomes optional. That is why we must keep telling this story, not as history, but as prophecy. The Einsatzgruppen are gone, but the impulse that created them remains buried like a landmine in human nature, waiting for fear to step too close. The men who killed in the forests believed history would bury their crimes. They burned the bodies, they crushed the bones, they scattered the ashes. But the earth refused to cooperate. It kept their secret only until the next thaw, and when the ice melted, the truth surfaced again. Not because justice demanded it, but because truth has its own momentum. The universe has a strange morality. It doesn't always punish evil, but it never fully forgets it either. If you visit those places now, Babi Yar, Ponary, Rumbula, Mali Trostanets, you will not find screaming ghosts. You will find wind, birds, wildflowers. You will see school children placing stones, tourists taking photographs, survivors standing quietly, with tears that time has not diluted. The world has rebuilt itself above their graves. But beneath the grass, beneath the roots, lies the sediment of human choice. The soil does not accuse, it simply remembers. And maybe that is the final lesson. Remembrance is not revenge, it is resistance. To remember is to deny oblivion its victory. Every name spoken aloud, every document preserved, every grave marked, every film made, they are acts of defiance against the idea that what was done can be undone by time. The Einsatzgruppen believed their deeds would vanish with the bodies. But we are still speaking their names, and more importantly, the names of those they tried to erase. That persistence, that refusal to forget, is humanity's redemption. The darkness of that era was absolute, but even in it, there were flickers of light, people who hid their neighbors, soldiers who refused orders, prisoners who bore witness so that truth would outlive them. They are proof that conscience can survive even inside hell. Their courage did not end the killing, but it preserved something sacred, the knowledge that even in the most corrupt system, choice remains. That is what the perpetrators feared most, not punishment, but memory. Because memory means accountability, and accountability is the one thing evil cannot endure. When you lie down tonight, close your eyes, and let the darkness fold over you. Remember this: the comfort you feel in safety was once someone's impossible dream. The quiet of your room, the hum of your heartbeat, these are luxuries denied to millions whose only crime was being born. Their story is not an echo, it is a warning. The past is not past, it waits, it watches, it whispers. The world keeps turning, but the lesson of the darkness remains unchanged. The Einsatzgruppen are gone, their victims are gone. But the capacity for cruelty and for courage remains in us all. History does not end. It sleeps, lightly, beneath the skin of civilization. And when it stirs, when the air grows heavy, and the language of hate becomes ordinary again, we must remember what the silence of the earth tried to tell us. The lesson is simple, and it is terrible. Humanity's worst acts were not committed by monsters, but by men who forgot they were human. And as the stars turn over Europe, over the forests, the fields, the forgotten graves, the wind moves through the grass like breath through a lung. It carries with it a whisper, faint but eternal. Remember us, because in remembering them, we remember ourselves. And that is the only light, powerful enough to hold back the darkness that waits just beyond the edge of sleep.